Chapter 23:16. After Zhang Yan sent the Taoist into the river of Tao, he kept his eyes on it. With his qi dynamic as a guide, if he saw the Taoist showing signs of being submerged, he could bring the Taoist back at any time. Whether or not he could find the Tao technique was secondary. At least in the process of his cultivation, this person had helped him before, so there was no need to be too materialistic about this matter. Fortunately, the Taoist's judgment of himself was not wrong. He didn't stay in the river for long before he found something. Zhang Yan instantly felt something. Using his own strength as the foundation, he affected the person's Weili qi dynamic. In an instant, the person walked out of nothingness. The Taoist said, "Fellow Taoist, I already know where the Tao technique is, but it won't be easy to find it. Therefore, I feel that perhaps we can use a more covert method to obtain the Tao technique." Zhang Yan thought about it and had a guess in his heart. He said, "Fellow Taoist, are you going to transfer your consciousness to the Weili?" The Taoist said, "Yes, the Weili that carries the Tao technique is just a ruler without a will. I should perform a spell here to trigger the Weili's response. From there, I can transfer my consciousness over and control the Weili. Not only can I gather strength, but I can also find the Tao technique. By then, even if the spirit of creation makes a move, he won't be able to take the Tao technique from me." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. This method was indeed better than sending the person to that place. Even though it was a little difficult, it wasn't difficult to overcome. The Taoist said again, "After this, I'm afraid it will be difficult for me to return with my own strength. I still need fellow Taoists' help here." Zhang Yan knew his concerns. After all, he was looking for the Tao technique under the eyes of the spirit of creation. If his whereabouts were to be leaked, he would be swallowed up and the spirit of creation would benefit for nothing. He said, "When the time comes, fellow Taoist only needs to transfer your consciousness and I will be able to bring you back." The Taoist bowed his head and sat down cross-legged. For Vedanta, there was no such thing as distance. It was only the collision of the mighty powers of the deity refinement cultivators and mighty figures that caused them to be obstructed no matter where they went. If he had enough almighty power, he could ignore it. However, he had only recovered a small portion of his almighty power, so it would be very inappropriate for him to go over just like that. However, transmitting his will was an exception. However, it wasn't that there wasn't any danger here. If he didn't find the mighty power in the end, then it was very likely that this strand of will wouldn't exist. Moreover, there weren't many ways to hide his will, so it was very easy for the divine will of others to invade it. However, this was the safest method at the moment. Zhang Yan only waited for a moment before he sensed that the person's will was no longer in the mighty force incarnation. Because there was no main consciousness, after the person's figure dissipated, it turned into wisps of mighty force that floated in the all things. This was a desperate move for this person. If he didn't succeed, he wouldn't be able to come back. At this moment, the spirit of creation shouldn't know that his plot had been seen through by them. It seemed that the chances of success were very high, but with that sliver of change in the heavenly secrets, there was no absolute in this battle. He thought for a while and informed the two ancestors, Yao Han and Hong He. If things didn't work out, then he would rather make his move earlier than let the spirit of creation benefit. The Taoist only felt his consciousness spread out for an unknown amount of time before he felt his body sink. His senses became much clearer, and with a thought, he felt a mighty force being channeled into his body. He sighed in his heart, "I was testing the Tao with my whole life. Who knew that the heavens would break and the fortune would fall?" At this moment, he knew that when he saw the spirit of creation devouring his peers, he did disperse himself. However, it wasn't just to escape from the hands of the spirit of creation. In fact, at that time, his vision was very far. He didn't just want to avoid being devoured by the spirit of creation. Instead, after seeing the robbery power, he expected that both the great virtue of creation and the spirit of creation would be isolated outside of the everything. According to his original plan, when his consciousness merged with the Weili, he would be the first to wake up among the things. He would come down and rebuild his body. Then, he would find the missing Tao and find a way to deal with the spirit of creation. According to his original plan, when his consciousness merged with the Weili, he would be the first to wake up among the things. He would come down and rebuild his body. Then, he would find the missing Tao and find a way to deal with the spirit of creation. Unfortunately, what he did not expect was that the collision of the tribulation power was far beyond his expectations. Perhaps it was because of that sliver of heavenly secrets that the scattered power was unable to gather in the end. His mind became even more incomplete, and naturally he could no longer recover his original body as he had originally planned. Although he had retrieved all of this now, it was too late. He raised his head and looked up. After recovering a certain amount of the Wei, he only needed a little effort to retrieve all of the energy that was scattered in the place of creation. However, the commotion here was enough to attract the attention of the spirit of creation. Once the Wei descended, he would definitely not be able to leave by relying on his own strength. He made a prompt decision. Retrieving the Tao was already enough. There was nothing worth delaying any longer. With a thought, he immediately sent his consciousness to where Zhang Yan was. In the next moment, the spirit of creation's Wei descended. However, apart from some scattered Wei, nothing else was left behind. The Taoist was dazed for a moment. When he came back to his senses, he saw that he had already appeared in front of Zhang Yan. He cupped his hands and said, "Thank you for your help, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan, fellow Taoist, now that you've retrieved the Tao, are you willing to come to the great Tao chessboard? The Taoist shook his head and said, "There's no need for that. Even if I retrieve all of the Wei, it won't be enough for me to sit on the chessboard. However, I can send my Tao to help everyone." Handing over his Tao was the most correct choice at the moment. This was because only by defeating the spirit of creation on the great virtue's side could he truly retrieve his Tao. If the spirit of creation won, there was no other possibility other than being devoured. Zhang Yan didn't say anything else. He only solemnly bowed to the Taoist. The Taoist returned the bow and focused his mind. He was about to hand over the Tao, but suddenly he felt that something was wrong. He thought about it a few times, but he didn't find anything strange. He shook his head, thinking that there was some resistance in his heart. However, this was a battle of Tao. He couldn't stay out of it. This was something he had to do. After calming his mind, he stirred up the Wei. At this moment, a sharp sword light slashed down, breaking everything in the surroundings. The scenery in front of him was also shattered. He looked up. Although Zhang Yan was still standing there, it was very different from what he saw just now. He thought about it and suddenly came to a realization. No wonder he felt that something was wrong just now. It turned out that he didn't escape from the spirit of creation's encirclement. Originally, there shouldn't be a problem with the guidance of the divine will. However, just now, when his consciousness crossed over, because the Wei of the spirit of creation was spread among everything, he was still contaminated with some of his Wei. As a result, when the divine will guided him, it fell into the divine will of the spirit of creation. Therefore, what he saw just now was actually formed by the spirit of creation, and he almost offered his Tao to that person. He sighed and said, "I'm ashamed. Just now, I almost ruined the big plan." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, don't blame yourself. This isn't your fault. It's hard to guarantee your safety when your consciousness is traveling. Fortunately, the spirit of creation didn't succeed in the end." The Taoist nodded repeatedly and said, "Since I have returned, I will quickly hand over the Tao to you to avoid delaying the big plan." Zhang Yan looked at him and asked, "Friend, now that you have recovered your memory, how should I address you?" The Taoist said, "God descends upon the emptiness of the Tao, illuminating all things to be complete. Fellow Taoist can just call me Xian Zhao." When he finished speaking, he cupped his hands and bowed. His body disappeared like a cloud of smoke. At the same time, Zhang Yan also felt that he had one more Taoist spell in his hand. This time, it could be said that they had won. If they waited any longer, Bu Xiutian would quickly combine the creation essence. With this bargaining chip in hand, their chances of winning would be greater. However, he knew that the spirit of creation was not so easy to deal with. Before the person was defeated, it was too early to say anything. Just as he was thinking, he felt something strange. The chessboard of the Great Path was moved again. It was obvious that the spirit of creation had placed another Tao piece. He looked over and saw a trace of the power of the robbery spreading among the things. Previously, although he, the Vedanta, and the spirit of creation worked together to eliminate this power, they only transferred it to the side of the great path of nothingness. However, this thing still existed. At this moment, the spirit of creation had used a Taoist technique as the price to release this power once again. He immediately went into the divine will and communicated with the two patriarchs, Hong Ho and Yaoan. They agreed that the spirit of creation did this to separate them from the things. This move was undoubtedly a critical one, because all the pieces on their side had been placed in Zhuyu. Even if Bu Xiutian combined the essence of creation, it would still be the same. If Bu Xiutian succeeded, then all of their arrangements would be cut off. This move could be considered as taking drastic measures to remove the firewood from under the cauldron. Zhang Yan pondered for a moment. This move by the spirit of creation was very clever. If they did not deal with the power of the robbery, then they would not be able to place a piece in the things. If they placed a piece elsewhere, then the advantage of accumulating Tao pieces would be gone. The spirit of creation should have already planned this. However, in his opinion, if the spirit of creation had acted a little later and allowed them to place a piece in the things, then perhaps the result would be even greater. The spirit of creation was in such a hurry to act now because it saw that they had obtained another Tao technique. The threat it could cause was already great, so it had to act in advance to stop this momentum. His eyes flashed slightly. Although this had caused them to be somewhat passive, the fact that the robbery power had been released meant that they could once again pursue and search for the Taoist technique hidden behind this power. It seemed like the spirit of creation wanted to pluck the Taoist technique from this place to win back a piece. Chapter 23:17. Zhang Yan thought that even though the spirit of creation had competed with them for the Tao arts of the Tao of imperfection and the Tao of strength, even if they were to fight again, if it didn't utilize enough Tao arts, then it would still lose. This was because to a certain extent, the ownership of these two Tao of strength was determined by the living beings of the lower levels. Once the spirit of creation manifested, it would be in the upper levels. Its goal was to seize the Tao and reach a higher realm. Therefore, it would only target those great virtues who controlled Tao of strength. It wouldn't even pay much attention to ordinary spirit refinement cultivators, let alone ordinary living beings. Therefore, its true body could be said to have no contact with the lower levels. In terms of the arrangements placed in the Zhuyu, it was far inferior to the great virtues of humanity. Even if the spirit of creation was born, most of them wouldn't be willing to return to their true bodies. They weren't on the same path. However, the Tao of strength behind the robbery power was different. It didn't fall to the lower levels at all, so this fight was the most direct clash. There were no other tricks that could be used. Of course, he could also choose to place a Tao of strength on his side to gain enough help. However, the problem was that he had placed his pieces in the Zhuyu. Suddenly changing sides now would mean giving up the advantage he had accumulated. Unless it was absolutely necessary, it wasn't worth it. His connection with the divine wills of Grandmaster Hongba and Grandmaster Yao Han had never been severed. When the two sensed the sudden change in the situation, Grandmaster Hongba was the first to speak. Since the spirit of creation wants to fight with me for the Tao behind the power of calamity, we have no need to fear him. Although a few of our fellow Taoists have been devoured, they have left behind the Tao they have comprehended in here. Later, the two of us can hand them over to you to fight against this fellow. Patriarch Yao Han said, although we can comprehend the Tao of strength left behind by our fellow Taoists, we're still a little short of seizing this Tao of strength. The robbery power was drawn out by the spirit of creation's peace. Now that we have the Tao of strength chessboard to help us, and this fellow has collected many Tao of strength before, if we do things according to plan, I'm afraid this fellow will seize this Tao of strength before we do. Zhang Yan fell into deep thought. Grandmaster Hongba's judgment was based on the abilities he had displayed previously. He believed that even if the other party had a great advantage, he would still be able to seize the Tao technique. And founding ancestor Yao Han's words weren't without reason. If he and the spirit of good fortune fought over the Taoist magic, then they would have to go all the way to the end. If he lost, he lost. If he won, he won. If he lost, 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 he won. However, when the spirit of creation pushed the Great Path chessboard, it borrowed the power of the entire Great Path. The reason why he was so powerless to stop the merging of the essence of creation was because of this. No matter what method he used, he could only stop the flow of the Great Path for a moment, but he couldn't shake the general trend. Moreover, he discovered another problem. Right now, refining the good fortune essence had become difficult, and this was because there was an additional layer of robbery power blocking the way. If he didn't refine the good fortune essence in time, he was likely to lose his position as the master. Fortunately, he had accumulated a lot, so there shouldn't be a problem in the short term. However, if the spirit of creation obtained the tribulation energy Tao art, then it could trap him and the two founding ancestors here. Even though the spirit of creation might not be able to do anything to them with the Tao art, the combined essence of creation might be seized by it. He pondered for a while, and all the pros and cons flowed through his mind. But although the spirit of creation currently had the advantage to obtain the Tao technique behind the robbery power, they still had to rely on their own deduction. The other party had the Great Path behind them, so it wasn't like he didn't have any help. With a turn of his mind, he had already sunk into the broken jade. In Xianyuan heaven, Zhang Yan's incarnation was originally sitting here, but the clear light on his body was a little different from before. His whole body seemed to be blocked by something, and he looked like he was turning from existence to non-existence. This was precisely because of the robbery power. At first, the robbery power only targeted the original Vedanta, and he wasn't among them. But this time, he was also enveloped in it, and even his incarnation was included. Moreover, this incarnation would continue to be weakened until it completely disappeared from the all things. When the good fortune essence was broken, many Vedanta had tried to leave an incarnation behind, but the result was that they couldn't maintain it for too long. Taoist Xian Zhao had long seen this, so he dispersed the Weili and forcibly left the Tao technique Weili in the all things. But at the same time, he couldn't escape the aftermath of the robbery power. If Zhang Yan hadn't discovered some clues in advance, in the end he still wouldn't have been able to escape the fate of being taken away by the spirit of creation. Jingyu, who was at the side, saw this strange scene and said in surprise, "Master?" Zhang Yan's incarnation smiled faintly and said, "It's okay, it's just the aftermath of the battle." Even if this incarnation couldn't be saved, it was impossible to completely eliminate the Weili. Just like how there was still a weak Weili left after the Vedanta was banished into eternal silence, and even if he only had a trace of power left, it was enough to be placed in the all things. In Buxa heaven, after Qin Sheng, Xin Chang, Zhan Yuan, and the others had reached an agreement with the incarnations of the spirit of creation, although both sides seemed to get along well on the surface, they had always been secretly on guard against this generation. If they found anything wrong, they would immediately join forces to suppress this generation. Therefore, the situation had always been tense. They were also constantly paying attention to the battle between the Vedanta, but with the appearance of the robbery power, they suddenly felt a sense of oppression, and the pressure was getting heavier and heavier. Even their figures were becoming unstable. They quickly realized that if this continued, it was very likely that they would disappear from the all things and enter eternal silence. To the spirit of creation, all the almighty cultivators of the human Tao were his enemies, so the robbery power he released this time was aimed at all the almighty cultivators who had transcended the present world. Therefore, not only the Vedanta, but even the ordinary soul refinement cultivators would be affected. Unlike the Vedanta, they had no way of resisting this kind of power. Taoist Shun Chang sensed it for a moment, and his expression turned serious. This power is difficult to resist. Now that fellow Taoist Xuanyuan's Weili has been separated, there is no way for us to resolve it. It seems that we can only rely on the power of Buxa heaven to resist it. Perhaps we can delay it. Everyone agreed, and even the most conceited Qin Sheng had no intention of refuting. This was the only choice they had at the moment. Everyone immediately used their techniques and hid in the depths of Buxa heaven. Mountain and Sea Realm, Yaoyin Clan, Lonely Spoon Mountain's Grand Hall. Wei Zihong had been paying attention to the changes in the battle. At this moment, he saw that the figures were becoming blurry, and he knew that something had happened. At this moment, he suddenly felt that something was wrong. He felt that the aura that his master had immersed himself in this world was fading away. He thought for a moment, then took out a magical talisman that Zhang Yan had given him. When he saw that the talisman did not show any signs of weakening, he immediately realized that it was not that his master's magic power had been damaged in the fight against the spirit of creation, but that something had blocked his master's connection to the world. Without a doubt, the problem lay with the spirit of creation. He put the magical talisman away and immediately looked toward the all heavens and realms. He knew that the magic power of almighty cultivators was weakening, and even if it was not deliberately targeted, it would still cause some changes in the world. Sure enough, after observing for a while, he discovered some problems. The cultivators who cultivated in the spirit of creation's Taoist magic, which had originally been advancing rapidly, began to show signs of weakening. Clearly, they were also affected. However, although their cultivation speed had slowed, the number of people who cultivated in this magic did not decrease at all. In fact, it was constantly increasing. This was because the spirit of creation's Weili originally filled all the realms. Because Buxu heaven had been merged with the land of good fortune, the spirit of creation's Weili was also included. If Zhang Yan had continued to refine it, then he would have been able to expel it. But now that he was separated from the tribulation power, the spread of the spirit of creation's Weili increased. Because the spirit of creation's Weili was too high, the living beings in the realm of creation were not directly affected. The main reason for this was because of the formation of the heavens and the earth. There were also many cultivators who worshipped the spirit of creation's Taoist magic who preached the Tao. That was why the Tao of creation's Taoist magic was so widespread. Most of this had actually been restrained by Yen Jiao. But the mountain and sea realm was different. The Yen sect was weak here, and they knew that there were many great sects here, so they didn't do anything. As for the sects, they only cared about the 4 continents. They weren't too keen on killing the spirit of creation's Taoist magic. However, the mountain and sea realm was vast, and there were many lower realms where cultivators had never set foot. Therefore, the spirit of creation's Taoist magic was a good place to hide. The spirit of creation knew how powerful the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm were, and didn't dare to provoke them. They hid far away in the lower realms to build up their strength. But now, their power was rapidly expanding. Wei Zihong recognized the danger. He knew that once the spirit of creation's Taoist magic was cultivated, there would be no obstacles to their cultivation base. Previously, his master had been suppressing them with magical power, so he wasn't afraid of them. But now, if he didn't do anything about it, it would become a huge problem. He said, "My master is fighting an enemy, so I, as his disciple, should take care of the situation in the realm." With that, he called out, "Then." A disciple walked in and said, "Sect leader, what are your orders?" Wei Zihong's voice was low as he said, "Send a message to all disciples. These are extraordinary times. Anyone who worships the spirit of creation's Taoist magic must have their cultivation base sealed and their memories severed. If they resist stubbornly, their souls will be destroyed." After a moment's consideration, he added, "Also, ask the Ox-Wm tribe's demon patriarch to come visit me. After enjoying so many benefits, it's time for him to do some work." The disciple replied solemnly, "Disciple will go deliver the message." When the sects of the 9 continents had first arrived in the mountain and sea realm, the demon patriarch had been the person who stood at the pinnacle of the realm. But now, as more and more upper realm cultivators began to appear, the demon patriarch was no longer a threat to the sections. His status had also declined. Therefore, with a single word from Wei Zihong, the demon patriarch had to travel across the 4 continents to come to the mountain and sea realm. The disciple who had delivered the message felt that it was only natural. If the demon patriarch refused, then it would be a good time to clean him up. Chapter 23:18. Under the influence of the tribulation power, many mortal metamorphosis cultivators who were watching the battle from all over the universe suddenly discovered that whether it was the spirit of creation or the remaining few Vedanta, their figures began to dim and showed signs of returning to nothingness. This was because Dan E, as a spirit refinement cultivator, was similarly blocked by the tribulation power. As his Wei weakened, the scenery he transmitted was also affected. This was a great shock to the present world, even more so than the disappearance of the few Vedanta previously. Even though many people had extremely high cultivation, they could not understand the situation of the battle, nor did they know how the high-level Taoist techniques worked. However, they could still see that the three Vedanta were still confronting the spirit of creation. And now, the situation seemed to be wrong. Had the spirit of creation been defeated, or had the Vedanta lost? The more unclear the outcome, the more uneasy it was. In particular, when some cultivators saw Dan E and offered him a memorial tablet, but now, they saw that the honorific name on the tablet was gradually fading, which made them even more terrified. In fact, the real reason here was because Dan E was only an ordinary spirit refinement cultivator. If he allowed the tribulation power to continue pressuring him, he might really be driven into eternal silence. However, for a great virtue like Ling Yu, even if he was devoured by the spirit of creation, it would only be equivalent to being sealed, and he would not truly enter eternal silence. Thus, his honorific name was still worshipped in the Nether Spring sect without any change. Unless the spirit of creation won in the end, there would not be any changes for the time being. Fortunately, these cultivators also knew that panicking at this moment would not solve the problem. They communicated with each other for a while and all thought that the Vedanta and the spirit of creation did not seem to be making any big moves. Perhaps the aftermath of the battle had implicated Dan E. Things were not as bad as they imagined. At this moment, in the headquarters of the Yen sect, the upper echelons of the Yen sect also saw the scenery on the jade disc shaking and becoming dim. However, Zhang Yan's incarnation was still there, and it was still far from disappearing. Therefore, the people here were calm, but they guessed that the battle between the upper echelons was very intense. Gao Chengte looked at the geomantic map at the side. The lights on it had already connected into one. As more and more domains merged in, the number of people in Yanjiao was clearly insufficient. Even if they were to transfer people from all over, it would not be enough. Furthermore, they could not blindly do this. After all, they could not destabilize the control of the original territory for the sake of a new territory. Ever since the Yen sect grew stronger, it had been a long time since they had encountered such a thing. He said in a low voice, "The Tao arts of the spirits of creation are everywhere. Now, more and more worlds have appeared, and it's difficult for us to occupy them one by one. However, if I don't send disciples to pass down the arts, those worlds might be reduced to the grounds of the spirits of creation. At that time, I'm afraid that even my Yen sect will find it difficult to resist. Elders, do you have any suggestions?" This was not him exaggerating. It was the truth. The merged lands of creation were the reincarnations of many spirits of creation. Even though the majority of them were unwilling to lose themselves, not everyone could clearly recognize themselves. There would always be some people who would walk the path of worshipping the Tao arts. The most troublesome thing was that this generation cultivated extremely quickly. They could reach the peak of the world in almost a short amount of time. If it was not for the obstruction of the origin jade, they would not stay in the world for long. They would directly transcend the present world and return to their original bodies as the spirits of creation. However, due to the merging of the essence of creation, although it was much easier to find origin jade, there were similarly many people fighting over it. This caused this generation to remain in the present world. They only had one view towards humanity. If they did not worship the Tao arts of the spirits of creation, then they were enemies. Moreover, only by stirring up karma could they cause more origin jade to enter the world. For this reason, they would definitely incite endless battles. The elders were also at their wits' end, but this problem had to be solved. They had already achieved the reincarnations of the spirits of creation. They could only slowly think of ways to deal with them. However, at the very least, they had to curb this trend and prevent these people from increasing. Elder Daoren said, "The founding master is fighting with the spirits of creation. He has no time to care about such a small matter. Why don't you try to ask the world creator Yuan Zun to help? Tang Yu immediately objected, "Our Yen sect is under the Taishang Vedanta. How can we ask for help from Yuan Zun?" Gao Qingtu was actually not against asking for help from Yuan Zun. Even though they were under the Taishang Vedanta, they themselves were not Vedanta. How could they dare to look down on the world creator Yuan Zun? However, he could feel that matters involving the spirits of creation were not something that could be resolved by just relying on the cultivators of the upper echelons. Otherwise, why would they need to ask for help? If they could make a move, they would have made a move long ago. He thought about it and said, Yuan Zun has his own considerations. If he doesn't make a move, does that mean we won't put up a resistance? Another elder suggested, "Leader, why don't we ask for help from others?" Gao Qingtu shook his head and said, "The Tao technique of the spirits of creation is spreading in all the realms. Now, all the sects can't even take care of themselves. Why would they come and help us?" Elder Daoren said, "Leader, the people I'm talking about aren't those big sections. I'm talking about the few Taoist sects that were once my enemies. This generation had once sent an emissary here, wanting to destroy the Tao technique of the spirits of creation with us. However, we were afraid that he had other motives, so we rejected him. Even though Xiangjue, Wei Ming, and Ji Zhuang were borrowing the spirits of creation, their Tao techniques did not transform into the Tao technique of the spirits of creation. This was because whether it was establishing Tao or imparting Tao techniques, they were all directed at the Weili themselves and not the spirits of creation. Even if they were swallowed up, the Weili that were left behind did not disappear because of this. Therefore, all the Tao techniques were still maintained there. One must know that they were the spirits of creation. The Tao only pointed out a path to progress. With those superior Tao techniques, those with aptitude could still cultivate to the upper realm. It was just that they would still be obstructed by the primordial jade. The disciples of these few Tao techniques had been fighting against the Tao techniques of the spirits of creation. Now, they were still very active and had no intention of giving up. Of course, they were not doing this for the living, but purely for themselves. If these few sects wanted to develop their forces, they needed to avoid the big sections. Similarly, the Tao techniques of the spirits of creation had the same thought. Therefore, there was no doubt that the two were in conflict. Originally, they were also enemies with Yan Jiao. However, the problem was that after so many years of fighting, they had never gained the upper hand. Moreover, Yan Jiao mainly focused his energy on the boundaries that did not have spiritual opportunity. Therefore, the conflict was not that big. In order to fight against the Tao techniques of the spirits of creation that were gradually growing in power, these few sects had to take the initiative to ask for an alliance. It was just that Yan Jiao previously did not care about them. After Gao Qingtu asked about the reason, he thought that he could rope in these few sections. Even if he gave up some of the boundaries to these few sects, it was still better than being occupied by the Tao techniques of the spirits of creation. He pondered for a long time before saying to Elder Daoren, "This is a feasible idea. We can invite the envoys of these few sects to my headquarters for a discussion. We can delineate the boundaries so that there will be no more conflicts when we do things." On top of the Great Path chessboard, Zhang Yan was currently calculating and searching for the Tao technique behind the robbery power. Although he made use of the remnant jade to deduce, the robbery power was able to trap the Vedanta and the spirit of creation and caused both sides to fight together. Naturally, it was not something that could be easily seized. Moreover, the robbery power itself was still constantly changing. There was no certain conventional logic. Even if he deduced a path that seemed feasible, it might not be the right path. He needed to use his own Weili to continuously collide with it in order to be sure and then proceed with the deduction. Therefore, the progress was not very fast. It was the same principle. Although the spirit of creation had the great Tao chessboard behind it, it didn't achieve much in the beginning. Judging from the current progress of the Tao technique, the two of them seemed to be neck and neck. Ancestor Yao Han and Ancestor Hongho did not sit still. They were also deducing and eliminating the robbery power. Every time they eliminated a portion of the robbery power, the spirit of creation would be able to deduce a portion less. However, the comprehension of the Tao technique they obtained could be handed over to Zhang Yan in the end, so that they could save more time and effort in deducing. After a series of deductions, Zhang Yan's consciousness emerged from the remnant jade. He got up from his whaley and eliminated a portion of the robbery power to verify it again. Although he felt that his chances of winning were higher, he did not forget the existence of that trace of heavenly secrets. Therefore, he did not feel that he would definitely be able to suppress his opponent. He was also prepared for the possibility of failure. Up until now, almost all the Dao techniques that were originally wandering outside had been seized by their side. However, there was still a difference in strength between Dao techniques. The Dao technique behind the robbery power was almost on par with the entire Dao of strength. If this Dao technique was seized by the spirit of creation, they might have no choice but to use a chess piece to salvage the situation. However, in this way, the situation that they had painstakingly created would no longer exist. Similarly, although the spirit of creation could completely turn the situation around if he won this chess piece, if he still lost, then it would be very difficult for him to devour them on the Great Path chessboard. At that time, it was very likely that he would choose to come down from the Great Path chessboard and directly resort to force. After all, from the perspective of the spirit of creation, even if he could not obtain the Dao technique, he could devour the person who obtained the Dao technique. However, it was easy to go up the Great Path chessboard, but it was not so simple to retreat from it. If both sides did not agree, then the side that took the initiative to leave would definitely have to pay a corresponding price. Especially the side that did not have an advantage, the price would be even higher. Therefore, he would either use some other method to turn the situation around, or he would simply retreat decisively to avoid suffering even more losses. At this time, he took the opportunity to observe the combination of the essence of creation and found that his perception of this place was becoming increasingly weaker. Fortunately, the spirit of creation's previous move to release the tribulation power had only given him an advantage in terms of deduction. Before the spirit of creation grasped the tribulation power, he was also blocked by the tribulation power and could not directly interfere with this place. However, in his heart, he felt that since the spirit of creation had taken the initiative to release the robbery power, then it would definitely do something. Therefore, he could not delay for too long. Otherwise, if something happened, Bu Xiutian might escape from his control. Chapter 23:19. In the present world, the spirits of creation who worship the Tao would find a way to transcend the present world as soon as they reached the true yang level, and then return to the spirits of creation. But this time, just as Zhang Yan had expected, the spirits of creation had already made certain arrangements before releasing the tribulation power. In particular, the spirits of creation had sensed that once the lands of creation essence merged, they would definitely pose a great threat to themselves. As such, they intended to get their hands on this piece of land. They planned to first refine this land before handing it over to the true yang. Zhang Yan's incarnation had not completely disappeared, and there was still the whaley in Bu Su Tian, so they did not succeed for the time being. However, in this situation, they had to resist both the tribulation power and the spirits of creation, the whaley, which had become extremely aggressive. They needed someone to share the pressure for him. However, many spirit refinement cultivators had retreated into the depths of Bu Su Tian, and the whaley was still declining. It would not be long before they would be driven into eternal silence. They would not even be able to protect themselves, let alone come out to help. However, it was difficult to count on these people now, but it did not mean that there was no one he could use. As long as he could help a true Yang Yuanzun transcend, these people would not be enveloped by the tribulation power, so they could share the pressure for him. It was not that the spirits of creation did not take precautions against this. In order to prevent the human Dao Yuanzun from transcending and going against him, several spirits of creation did not leave the present world after reaching the true Yang level. Instead, they tried to put pressure on the human Dao Yuanzun, not giving them the chance to cultivate the Dao. Because these people had cultivated to the peak, even though they were fewer in number than the human Dao Yuanzun, they were not at a disadvantage. This was why Gao Qingtu felt that asking for help from the true Yang Yuanzun would be useless, because the latter had his own opponents to deal with. However, both sides had their own misgivings, which was why they exercised great restraint, ensuring that the confrontation was maintained at their own level to prevent the involvement from becoming too great. The spirit of creation was purely for the sake of achieving its own objective, while the human path Yuanzun was for the sake of maintaining the stability of the world. Zhang Yanhua's clone chuckled. The other party was trying to tell him that if he was promoted to the Yuan Venerate, he would be able to pull the body he had borrowed over to confront them. In the end, nothing would change. But how could he be threatened? For a cultivator to cultivate to the true Yang level, the key was to look at the origin jade. Although the number of origin jade had increased a little, it was not up to a person to decide where they would end up. Previously, this generation was only able to obtain origin jades because there were more creation spirits in those unknown territories, which gave them a slight advantage. But it was different now. Along with the gradual merging of the unknown realms, this generation was targeted by the Yen sect. Under the combined suppression of the Yen sect and many other sects, their power was already gradually fading away. It was much more difficult to obtain Yuan Jade than before. Unless the spirit of creation directly made a move to change the rules of the Great Tao and remove the restraints of the origin jade, but how could a person do such a thing? Therefore, these low-level cultivators were actually not as useless as they thought. They could also influence the balance of victory and defeat to a certain extent. The consciousness of Zhang Yan's incarnation turned, and a wisp of Wei Li drifted away. He had already gone to a certain place in the present world. This place was originally where the Mirror Lake was, and now it had also merged with the entire land of creation essence. However, even after merging with so many land of creation, the original land of creation essence that Bu Shutian possessed still occupied the majority of it. In a place where clear air was faintly discernible, an exquisite copper palace floated here. A person in a light purple robe, Daoren, was meditating here. He sensed something and his expression turned solemn. He stood up and looked outside, and saw a young Taoist in a black robe walking out from the void. He cupped his hands and said, "So it's the Shenyuan Grand Elder. Huantong greets you." Zhang Yan's incarnation raised his hand to return the greeting, and said, "Fellow Taoist, Huantong greets you." Huantong asked solemnly, "Grand Elder, do you have any instructions for me to do?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "There is indeed something. I'm currently fighting with the spirit of creation. This fellow is now borrowing the power of the great Tao chessboard to release the tribulation to prevent us, the Wei Li, from entering the world, and intends to swallow Bu Shutian and other land of creation essence for himself. This land is an important bargaining chip for me and the great benevolence to fight against this person, and it is indispensable. Therefore, I need fellow Taoists to transcend into the present world and help me protect this land." At this point, he added, "Although this is an opportunity, it is also dangerous. If it fails, fellow Taoist will not be able to return even if you want to. Fellow Taoist needs to consider carefully before replying to me." Originally, a person like Huantong who relied on him to return would not be able to transcend into the present world. However, with the help of a great benevolence like him who grasped several Taoist techniques and had the ability to be invincible, things would be different. However, although Huantong could rely on his help during the process of leaping into the spirit refinement realm, if his Taoist heart was unstable at the final moment and he could not control himself, then he might perish. Therefore, Zhang Yan specifically reminded him that it was up to him to choose whether he was willing to or not. Huantong said, "There's naturally no reason for this old Taoist to refuse the arrangements of the Venerable One. Besides, I've always wanted to repay the favor of the Venerable One by restoring my original body. If I can help the Venerable One, then this old Taoist is naturally willing to do so. Besides, there's such a fortuitous encounter to step into the upper realm. However, may I ask the Venerable One, why is such a fortuitous encounter for me?" Zhang Yan said, "Back then, fellow Taoist Huantong fought against the innate demons for the sake of the human path. You created your own seal and sealed Bu Shutian. I also admire your courage and breadth of mind, so I thought of fellow Taoist first. Even if Yuan Zun had some achievements, he did not have the same thoughts as him. There were also people like Michihito Ichido who did not have the heart to improve, so he did not consider Yuan Zun at all. Most of the people of the human path, Yuan Zun, was resurrected from his Weili body. This Huantong had sacrificed the most in the past, so he was willing to give him a proper result. Huantong thought about it and said, "I see." He bowed and said, "I am willing to accept the Taoist technique. Please grant me my wish, Grand Elder." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. He raised his sleeve and pointed at Huantong. Instantly, a ray of spiritual light entered the center of Huantong's brows. In an instant, the wonders of the great Tao spread out in front of Huantong's eyes. Especially with the help of the former's Weili body, Huantong's own realm continued to rise. When Huantong's cultivation was full, he felt that everything in the world was far away from him. Then, a brand new world spread out. At the same time, Huantong's figure disappeared from the current world. Zhang Yan's incarnation waited quietly on the spot. If he did not succeed, he would never be able to return. Fortunately, he only waited for a short while before he reappeared. Huantong had ascended to the upper state, but he did not look happy at all. Instead, his expression was solemn. Once he transcended, he could feel an omnipresent pressure in the outside world. Other than that, it was not difficult to notice that the Weili on Zhang Yan's body was fading away under the influence of a certain power. He guessed that this was the tribulation power that Zhang Yan had mentioned. He bowed and said, "Thank you, Grand Elder Shenyuan, for granting me my wish. What do you need me to do next?" Zhang Yan's incarnation said, "Fellow Taoist, you should be able to feel the Weili of the spirit of creation outside. If my incarnation fades away, I'll need you to find a way to maintain it." Huantong solemnly said, "I will not disappoint you." Zhang Yan's incarnation nodded at him and returned to Xinyuan heaven in the blink of an eye. Huantong alone was enough for the time being. Although the Weili of the spirit of creation would push those reincarnated bodies to the true yang level, it might not be able to advance further under the current situation. This was because there was the obstruction of the tribulation force. Even if these bodies that had reincarnated into the world walked the path of worshipping the Tao, once they transcended the world and didn't merge with the original body, as long as they were outside for a long time, they would definitely develop their own thoughts like the purple-clothed Taoist, and that would be finding opponents for themselves for no reason. But he also understood that there was no absolute in the world. The spirit of creation might rather let the land of creation essence fall into the hands of those reincarnated bodies than be occupied by the great virtue side. Therefore, it was best to bury a chess piece here, just in case. The spirit of creation's first chess piece was only to protect all beings from being destroyed, but it didn't protect those living beings. If the spirit of creation's mighty power discovered what he had set up here, then he might destroy all living beings without hesitation. Thinking of this, he raised his hand and the Tai divine pearl jumped out from the divine will and landed in his palm. He gently shook his sleeve and threw the object into the world. With the support of this object, the Weili would at least be able to maintain the living beings in the original world of Busu heaven. This time, he did not look for the true Yang Yuanzun. Instead, he looked down. There were countless outstanding people in the world who were not necessarily inferior to the reincarnated bodies of the spirit of creation. Most of them only lacked the opportunity of a Yuan Jade. If there was a suitable candidate in this generation, he did not mind promoting one or two. In fact, the confrontation between the great virtue and the spirit of creation was the luck of the chessboard of the Great Way. That thread of unfathomable mysteries of the heavens moved about, and it also increased the opportunities of the cultivators below. Some people originally had no hope of transcending. If they had this opportunity, they would definitely grab it at all costs. But for those with a deep foundation, there was no need to do so. Even without the help of those in the upper realm, they could still cultivate to the upper realm with their own strength. Originally, the most suitable person was the reincarnated body of the spirit of creation. Of course, this was referring to those who worshiped their own Tao. After this generation transcended, they could seize the power of the true body, and their progress was also far better than ordinary cultivators. With a little help, they could be used by him. But his main purpose this time was to ensure that the land of the essence of creation was in his hands. At the very least, the person who occupied it should be a cultivator of the human path like Huan Tong. If this land fell into the hands of those who had the same origin as the spirit of creation, their true body only needed to place a chess piece on the chessboard of the Great Way to easily seize this place. In order to avoid this flaw, these people could only find it among the ordinary spirits of creation. But he did not intend to interfere with those who had the fate of the Tao. Forcefully guiding them was not a good thing for them. Those who had no hope of cultivation but had an incomparably firm heart were his first choice. Chapter 23:20. Zhang Yan's avatar looked back and forth in the present world. Due to the merging of many similar worlds, the past and future were all on the same river. This did not mean that the present world did not have any forks, but that all the forks were the same, without exception or change. Under the observation of the Dada, only after reaching the end would another change begin. This was because the operation of the Great Tao had forcibly changed the original rules. It could also be said that this appearance of the present world was the order under the Great Tao. However, the Dada themselves were people who controlled part of the order, so if the Dada made a move, they could still make changes to specific things or people. It was not difficult for him to find a suitable person to entrust himself to. In the past, those outstanding people who had long disappeared from the mortal world were not necessarily inferior to the spirits of creation. It was only because they had not obtained the opportunity that they could not transcend. However, this time, he had the intention of guiding one person so the scope could be expanded. Aptitude was secondary, temperament and Tao heart were more important. In fact, his own disciple, Jiang Zheng, was originally the most suitable person. Once he succeeded, he would undoubtedly become an important helper. However, this thought only flashed through his mind for a moment before he rejected it. As a teacher, even if his disciple did not have the fate of Tao in this life, he could let him reincarnate into the world, and under suitable circumstances, bring him back again so that he could continue to cultivate. If he could not succeed in this life, then he could wait for the next life. There would always be a life where he could succeed. He was just like Fu Qingming, who kept giving Dugerhang chances, opening his memories time and time again. Now, he finally found the way to the upper realm. However, now that Jiang Zheng had reached the mortal metamorphosis level by relying on his own strength, the next hurdle he had to face was to sever his past and future body before his lifespan ended. If that was the case, then it was already enough. As long as his own lifespan was endless, then even if there was no external help, logically speaking, he would still be able to find the opportunity, so there was no need for him to do anything unnecessary. At this moment, after looking around, he already had many candidates in mind, but among them, there were only two who were most suitable. One of them was called Renji. He was a wandering cultivator from the Yuhuan All Heavens. Back when he was traveling here, he had watched Renji fight with someone and took him in as his disciple. Although Renji was not a true disciple of his, Renji had taught him before. Most importantly, this person's disposition was extremely firm. At that time, Chen Shi had once commented that this person had a firm will and indomitable will. Coupled with the fact that there was a period of fate between them, this person could be said to be extremely suitable for Chen Shi's requirements. Renji had already cultivated to the level of Grotto when he was in the Yuhuan Heavens. Originally, with the help of karma points, he did not lack any external objects for cultivation. If there were no accidents, he still had some hope of climbing to the upper state. However, there was a time when he fought with someone. Although he won, his Taoist foundation was shaken. Knowing that there was no hope for him to continue his cultivation, he cut himself off and left. In fact, this life was the closest he had ever been to reaching the upper path of Tao. After that, he had reincarnated many times, but he had not been able to successfully enter the Tao. If he wanted to continue his fate with the Tao, he did not know how many lifetimes he would have to wait, or perhaps he would never have the chance. The second person here was Du Shixuan, a disciple of the Zhongtai sect whom Chen Shi had met in the Dongsheng continent. This person was tenacious, courageous, and courageous. He had once stood on the side of the Qinsong school during the Battle of the Devil's Cave. He could be considered a person of merit. However, because he cultivated in the path of strength, he was ultimately unable to peek into the upper state. Although he had also gone through many reincarnations, He was still unable to find the fate to enter the Tao. He was willing to help these two people, so with a thought, he transformed a Tao technique and a Tao seed into the two people's memories of this life. As long as the two of them did not lose their Taoist heart, then even if they did not have external objects for cultivation, they could climb all the way to the peak of this world just by relying on the Tao seed. If they could really reach this step, when the time came, he would naturally use the Weili to guide them and once again help them on their journey. The reason why he did not let them succeed in one go was because under the protection of the Tai Divine Pearl, although the spirit of creation Weili could not break through this boundary and destroy all living beings, it might try to stop the lower realm cultivators from transcending beyond the world. Only with his help could they avoid this obstruction. Of course, Renji and Du Shixuan were only the two people he was most optimistic about, but the changes of the world might not necessarily happen according to his expectations, so he also placed his bets on the other candidates. Even if only one of these people could succeed, then his arrangements this time would not be considered to be in vain. In the depths of Buxa Heaven, after Shen Chong, Qing Xing, Zhan Yuan and the others hid here, they tried their best to shrink their qi activity in the Weili, trying their best to eliminate their involvement with the world. However, the robbery power was relentless. No matter where they hid, they could feel the oppressive force that was constantly eliminating their bodies. Here, they had to use all their strength to resist in order to stabilize themselves, but the more they resisted, the faster the Weili was destroyed. Fortunately, the Buxa Heaven Weili helped them to offset a part of the infection, so they could hold on until now. When the spirit of creation was broken, those ordinary spirit refinement cultivators who were involved in it could not hold on for long. Taoist Shun Chang observed for a while and found that everyone's figures were swaying like smoke, as if they would dissipate with the slightest twists and turns. Only Qing Xing remained the same. After all, he was only one step away from the great virtue realm, and his cultivation was at the top level among everyone. But at this time, Chen Shu's qi activity suddenly disappeared, as if it had never existed. After Taoist Shun Chang sensed this, he could not help but sigh, knowing that she had been driven into eternal silence. This was also because Chen Shu's cultivation was the weakest among everyone. Zhan Yuan and the others also felt this, and they sighed inwardly. In the face of such a situation, they could not do anything. Moreover, they might follow in her footsteps at any time. Just as everyone was sighing in fear, Qing Xing suddenly stood up and said coldly, "We have transcended the world and have the ability to overturn everything. How can we not do anything here?" As soon as he finished speaking, he walked out from his hiding place while facing the power of calamity. People like him originally did not believe in anyone except themselves. Only in the face of absolute power would they choose to yield for a while. Since he would fall into eternal silence either way, he would not sit still and wait for death. Taoist Zhan Yuan was shocked and hurriedly said, "What do you want to do, Taoist Qing Sheng?" Qing Sheng said, "Instead of being driven into eternal silence here, I might as well go out and fight with the creation spirit Weili. His true body is not here, so why should I be afraid of him?" Taoist Zhan Yuan frowned and said, "It's not about fear or not. Now that the robbery power is pressing down on us, we can only use up the Weili if we go out to fight it. But if we wait here and protect our Taoist bodies, we can respond in time if there are any changes." Qing Xing flicked his sleeves and said coldly, "Then you wait here. I will go out to fight against the creation spirit." Taoist Zhan Yuan still wanted to say something, but Taoist Shun Chang stopped him and shook his head. "Taoist friend, there is no need to stop Taoist Qing Sheng. What he said is not unreasonable." Taoist Zhan Yuan sighed and said, "Now that the Vedanta and the creation spirit are fighting, the robbery power is likely to be temporary. If we can hold on for a long time, we might be able to turn the situation around." Taoist Qing Sheng's cultivation is higher than ours, so as long as he can bear it, he will definitely hold on for a longer time than us. Shenchang Taoist nodded and said, "You are right, Taoist friend. However, when we do things, we have to follow our hearts. Taoist friend Azure Saint has always been aggressive and is not someone who is willing to lay low. Since his path is different from mine, there is no need to persuade him." In the blink of an eye, Qing Sheng had returned from the depths of Bushu Heaven to the outer layer. he suddenly felt that the pressure had increased by several times. His body swayed unconsciously, and his Taoist body, which was originally surrounded by a clear light, seemed to have dimmed a lot. But when he stood up again, he became much more solid. He could feel that the suppression of the robbery power on spirit enhancement cultivators was not only due to the expulsion of the Wei, but also due to the consciousness of one's Taoist heart. If one already thought that one had lost, then one would only become weaker and weaker. If one's Taoist heart was firm, one would be able to hold on no matter how weak one was. Even if a spirit enhancement cultivator was expelled into eternal silence, there would still be a weak Wei left in the all things. Just now Chen Shu had been expelled, but her Wei had not completely disappeared. He believed that as long as there was a Wei outside, he would not be completely submerged by the robbery power. So what if his strength was constantly reduced? As long as he stayed in the all things, there was still a chance. He felt that Shenchang, Zhan Yuan, and the others always had a trace of hope in their hearts, as if they had really fallen into eternal silence and the Vedanta would return them after winning. He snorted at this. Even if the Vedanta could really do such a thing, why would they come to help them? Unless there was someone who made a useful contribution in the battle with the Vedanta. Just now, there was a slight possibility. Therefore, instead of hiding in the depths of Busha heaven and blindly retreating, it was better to come out and fight with the creation spirit Wei. He wanted to let the Vedanta see that he had once contributed. Then, if the Vedanta were in a good mood, they might pull him out of eternal silence. Even if his judgment was wrong, it was better than doing nothing. After he stood still, he activated his mana and prepared to resist the mighty power of the spirit of creation. At this moment, an unfamiliar qi dynamic entered his senses. He looked over and saw an old Taoist sitting cross-legged there. The old Taoist seemed to feel his gaze as he stood up and cupped his hands in greeting. Qing Sheng immediately knew that this must be a fellow cultivator who had recently achieved success. Otherwise, he would not have been unaffected by the robbery power. Moreover, such a coincidence might have something to do with Zhang Yan. Thinking of this, he also bowed politely. However, he did not intend to go up and talk. Instead, he also sat down and used his dharma to fight against the creation spirit Wei. The creation spirit was not here, so the Wei could not do anything to him. Even an ordinary deity refinement cultivator like Huan Tong could also fight against this Wei. In fact, only the robbery power was his real enemy. However, although his body kept swaying, like a candle in the wind, he just stood there and did not extinguish. At this moment, there was a strange movement from the creation spirit Wei in the present world. Then, there was a strong qi dynamic that leaped out. Please remember this book's original domain name, 9 Heavens Shenhuang Mobile Version website. Chapter 23-21. Both Qing Sheng and Huan Tong's expressions turned solemn as if they were facing a great enemy. They were very familiar with this commotion. It was clearly a sign that someone from the lower levels had transcended and appeared in the world. There was no doubt that the spirit of creation, Wei, had released the shackles on the reincarnated body, which was originally at the true yang level, allowing it to directly enter the upper realm. There was a strong sense of hostility here. It was clear that their resistance had provoked the mighty power of the spirit of creation to respond. Qing Sheng immediately transmitted his thoughts to Huan Tong. Fellow Taoist, this reincarnated body originally worships Taoism. However, since he has transcended, he is no longer the same as before. Perhaps he is still being restricted by the Wei behind him, but once he understands his true self, he will no longer work for the true body. The best thing to do now is to delay. Huan Tong thought for a moment and replied, "Fellow Taoist's opinion is correct." The two of them reached an agreement and said nothing more. A moment later, a Taoist walked out from the world. When he saw Huan Tong and Qing Sheng, he seemed to realize that the two of them were his opponents. Without any hesitation, he immediately charged toward them while stirring up the endless Wei. Huan Tong's expression was solemn as he circulated his Wei with all his might to defend against the onslaught of the enemy's power. The body of the spirit of creation was of an extremely high level, and because of its worship of the Tao, even though it was just now, its aura was constantly rising. If this continued, its magic power would soon be on par with a cultivator in the second level of the spirit refinement realm. After Azure Saint realized this, he also felt that it was troublesome. Since he had to deal with the tribulation power, he was unable to contribute too much. This was because the more he fought, the shorter he would stay in all things, so he could only rely on himself here. However, he wasn't completely useless. Even if he just stood there without moving, he would still act as a form of deterrence to his enemies. If Huan Tong really did fall into danger, then he would naturally lend a helping hand. At this moment, he could still continue to resist the Wei spirit of creation in the outside world. As the Wei from both sides collided, in a split second, endless mysteries of the Tao flowed into each other's minds. Once a spirit refinement cultivator's magic powers fused together, they would be able to find out about each other's Tao. Only those who purposely hid their Tao would not be exposed. This was actually not a good thing for cultivators of the human path, because the Tao arts of the spirit of creation led directly to the upper realm. If one was not careful, then it was very likely that they would be bewitched by the Tao arts and abandon their own cultivation. This was also the reason why Zhang Yan prioritized a firm Tao heart when guiding lower-level cultivators. At the very least, such a person would not be easily shaken. Huan Tong had indeed seen those techniques, but he didn't pay much attention to them. All those years ago, he was willing to make great sacrifices for the sake of the human Tao, so his mental state would naturally not be shaken by this now. However, there was a difference in strength between the two sides. He was forced to retreat step by his opponent, but the gap in strength between the two sides had not reached a point where it could not be compared. Thus, even though he fell into a disadvantageous position, he was still able to maintain his undefeated state. Qing Sheng secretly reminded the Wei. Seeing that Huan Tong was no match for the Wei, he wanted to lend a hand. However, seeing the situation, he was slightly relieved. Since Huan Tong could handle the situation, there was no need for him to intervene. After Huan Tong dealt with a few more collisions, he acutely noticed that the spirit refinement cultivator's attacks had weakened a little compared to before. The spirit refinement cultivator's Wei was endless. The strong were strong, the weak were weak. Usually, there would not be a situation where the spirit refinement cultivator was powerless, unless there was a problem with the spirit refinement cultivator himself. He thought about it. The fusion of Tao arts was mutual. It was very likely that after the spirit refinement cultivator noticed his Tao arts, the spirit refinement cultivator's state of mind that purely worshipped Tao arts changed. At this moment, the Taoist's movements suddenly stopped. The Wei also stopped pressuring him. He just stood there without saying a word. Huan Tong also stopped in time. He clearly knew that he could not do anything to the spirit refinement cultivator with his own strength. Even if Qing Sheng came to help, it would be impossible for him to defeat the spirit refinement cultivator. It would be best if the spirit refinement cultivator could come to a realization on his own and stop being enemies with them. They might even be able to persuade the spirit refinement cultivator to join forces with them to fight against the true body of the spirit of creation. After a long silence, the Taoist stopped the rising qi activity on his body. He looked up and said, "I see. Speaking of which, I have to thank you all. Otherwise, I would have been devoured by the true body if I had taken another step forward." Huan Tong cupped his fists and said, "Congratulations, fellow Taoist." The Taoist said, "Don't be too happy too early. Even without me, someone else will come to replace me." Huan Tong said sincerely, "Even if someone else comes, they will also put you on the list. Why don't fellow Taoist join us to fight against your true body?" The Taoist remained silent. Huan Tong said, "Before fellow Taoist, there were already a few like you who had transcended. However, they are also being pressured by the power of tribulation. It won't be long before they fall into eternal silence." Seeing that the Taoist did not respond, he added, "It's reasonable that fellow Taoist is not willing to help us. In that case, please don't help either side. However, forgive me for being blunt, this is not a wise choice. If your true body wins this battle, you will not be able to maintain your independence. However, if those great benefices win, if you don't move, they will not be happy with you. Although it's a contest of power between two sides, everyone in the world is involved. No one can remain unaffected. After a long time, the Taoist finally said, I can help you, but you must let me enter the place of creation essence to hide. Huan Tong thought about it. Those who had realized their Tao were also hiding in the place of creation essence. Even if there was one more person, it would not be a problem. In fact, even if he did not agree, the Taoist could still enter and hide after spending some effort. He said, then it's settled. In a realm somewhere in the present world, Du Shixuan was meditating in a secret room. In this life, he was a disciple of a small sect called the Zhangkong sect. Ever since he had entered the Tao, he had quickly displayed his innate talent that was superior to others. After his teachers and peers saw his talent, they saw him as the only hope to raise the spirits of the sect. They poured all of their efforts into him and even gave him the cultivation materials that originally belonged to them. It could be said that they were using the entire sect's power to serve a single person. Perhaps it was a coincidence that not long after he entered Taoism, spiritual opportunity began to rise again. This was actually because after the tribulation power was released by the true body of the creation spirit, it cut off most of the Wei between him and the Vedanta. This caused the world to be less oppressed. It turned out that the spiritual opportunity had recovered naturally, and the recovery was very rapid. Many low-level Taoist cultivators did not know the real reason for this. Those who had cultivated for a long time had experienced the severing of their Tao, so they dared not be sure if the spiritual opportunity would change. Therefore, those who had good potential were seizing the opportunity to cultivate. It was the same for Du Shixuan. However, at this moment, he suddenly opened his eyes and frowned. Recently, whenever he meditated, he always felt that he could see some blurry images, which made it difficult for him to calm down and cultivate. He pushed the door open and went to the stone corridor outside. He welcomed the night wind and looked at the seawater under the moonlight. At this moment, a middle-aged cultivator passed by. Seeing that he did not cultivate as usual, he thought for a moment and walked up to him. He stood beside him and sighed, Junior apprentice brother, you've come at a good time. If the spiritual opportunity had recovered 30 years earlier, perhaps our Zhangkong sect would not be in this state now. Du Shixuan nodded silently. He knew that the seniors of his sect were actually quite talented. In the past, it was difficult for them to enter the upper state because of the decline of spiritual opportunity. It was not that there were no places with rich spiritual opportunity, but unfortunately, they were all occupied by the big sections. A small sect like Zhangkong sect was already blessed by the heavens for it to be able to maintain its sect and continue its inheritance. The middle-aged cultivator laughed bitterly and said, back then, there were many fellow cultivators who advised us to give up our sect and join the Yen sect. This way, we can cultivate immortality. To be honest, I also had this thought before. However, it was not easy for the founder to establish the sect. The seniors of the sect are waiting for me to receive them. How can I give up so easily? Because the Yen sect did not require any external objects to cultivate, there were many loose cultivators and even small sects that gave up on passing on their techniques and turned to join their sect. However, sects like the Zhangkong sect that valued inheritance were unwilling to do so no matter what. It should be known that changing sects was not a simple matter. Other than a few loose cultivators who received unknown techniques, ordinary sects would rely on the inheritance of master and disciple to receive the reincarnated person to enter the path of Tao again. If they joined another sect, then they would undoubtedly have to cut off all ties. This was unacceptable to many cultivators who valued inheritance. Du Shixuan knew what this senior brother meant. He was advising him not to slack off because of the revival of spiritual opportunity. Although he did not have such thoughts, he still said solemnly, Sect head senior brother, don't worry. The sect has treated me with great kindness and righteousness. I will not let the sect down. The middle-aged cultivator patted him on the shoulder and said, that's good. I'm ashamed to say it. I'm useless, but I can only entrust my hopes to junior brother. Although this is a little unfair to junior brother, my Zhangkong sect really has no other way out. Du Shixuan said, I understand. The pressure on his shoulders could not be said to be light, but the more it was so, the more his fighting spirit soared. It was also because of this unyielding willpower and spirit that he was able to achieve the expectations of the entire sect. After bidding farewell to the middle-aged cultivator, he returned to his seclusion area. He entered a meditative state once again. Not long after, many fragmented images appeared in his mind again. This time, he didn't choose to repel or suppress it. Instead, he allowed it to surge forward. He wanted to see just what kind of mysteries were hidden within. As the scenes flashed before his eyes, they became complete and he gained an understanding in his heart. These were his experiences in countless similar worlds. Most of the time, he was just one of the many living beings in the real world, but he also had many cultivation experiences mixed in. Especially in one life, his name was also Du Shishuan, and he seemed to have become the disciple of a great expert. In this life, he had cultivated to an extremely high level by relying on that supreme mental cultivation method. His heart involuntarily moved, and those cultivation experiences and cultivation methods were already clearly reflected in his mind. Please remember the domain name of this book. Mobile version. Chapter 23-22. In the main world, many people were enlightened by Zhang Yan in the Tao, but it was still uncertain which one of them would be able to attain the Tao in the end. Moreover, if the crisis faced by the land of creation essence could be resolved with the power of universality alone, then perhaps no one would be able to transcend into the world. At most, there would be a few more almighty cultivators in the world. Within the myriad of worlds, all the cultivators felt the heavens and the earth tremble. At the same time, they felt a tightness in their chest, as if a sledgehammer had struck their hearts, causing their souls to become unstable for a moment. Immediately after, as long as it was a living being, regardless of whether it was a plant spirit or a living being, they all felt dazed. However, this feeling came and went quickly, and they soon returned to normal. Most of the simple-minded people didn't care at all, and they just shook their heads and let it go. However, those who were serious would examine it repeatedly, and there were also many who were suspicious, but in the end, they couldn't find out anything. It wasn't just them, even those cultivators with profound cultivation couldn't find out the true reason behind this. Only those who had reached the true yang level could sense that this impact didn't originate from themselves or the myriad of worlds, but came from outside the world. Moreover, they could vaguely guess the true reason behind this. Due to the influence of the tribulation power, apart from a few places like the Yanjiao headquarters, most people were unable to see the confrontation between the great beneficence and the spirit of creation. They were also worried that something abnormal had happened to the battle. But very quickly, all the living beings in the world simultaneously forgot about this matter. This was because the true Yang Yuanzun was afraid that the world would be thrown into chaos, so he took the initiative to erase this matter from the memories of all the ordinary living beings. The change that occurred this time was actually because the spirit of creation Wei had sensed that the person it was pushing for had broken free from its control, and the fight for the land of creation essence was almost a failure. Therefore, it collided with everything and tried to annihilate all the living beings in the world, so as to cut off the living beings at the bottom from transcending. Although doing this would cause the fragments of the spirit of creation to be unable to enter the world, all the living beings in the world were formed from pure and turbid air. Therefore, even if they were destroyed, it wouldn't take long for them to be born again. However, they would no longer have anything to do with the previous living beings, and their connection with the great beneficence would also be severed. As for the body of the spirit of creation, it was fine as long as it was a human body. There was no need for talent at all. It could casually find a body and raise it up. However, in the end, the spirit of good fortune did not get what he wanted. After the great one divine pearl was thrown away by Zhang Yan, it wandered around the main world. As soon as the invading force landed, it was blocked by the pearl. Even though the aftermath had some effect on everyone, no living being was directly injured. In the depths of Busha heaven, Taoist Shunchang, it wasn't difficult to guess what had happened just now. Deist spirit of creation Wei would not give up, and would continue to try. Yang, Qing Qing Qin, Qing, 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 Hu, and Huan Qing, and realm, to be. Qing was still resisting. Yang God, Qing, Qing, Qing Qing, the Yang, the world. Amidst this ceaseless torment, the vital energy of all the God-rank refinement cultivators grew weaker, and under the pressure of the tribulation energy, the vital energy of Luan Fang and Bing Kong vanished without a trace. It wasn't just that, the vital energy of those spirits of creation that had been reincarnated into the world that were targeted by the tribulation energy had vanished as well. After an unknown period of time, Taoist Zhanyuan's divine will transmitted a message. Taoist friend Shunchang, I'm afraid that I can't hold on any longer. I can only bid farewell here. I only hope that my people will prevail and that we will meet again in the future. With that, he cupped his hands and cupped his hands. His figure gradually faded and soon disappeared. Shunchang Daoist sighed. Zhan Yuan's cultivation level was almost the same as his. Since Zhan Yuan had left, Shunchang Daoist would not be able to hold on any longer. He turned his head to a certain direction and saw Shunchang Tong hugging his knees as he sat in the lotus flowers. He was still sleeping soundly as if he knew nothing about what was happening outside. He knew that this brother of his in name was the one who had lasted the longest among them. This was because Shunchang Tong's thoughts were the purest among them and he had never acted recklessly towards any Weili. But at the same time, he shouldn't expect Shunchang Tong to be of any help. He thought to himself, fortunately, there are still two Taoist friends, Huan Tong and Qing Xing, outside. I only hope that they can control the situation so that my people's people won't fall. As his thoughts turned, he gradually felt that he was getting further and further away from all beings. Then, everything except himself disappeared. Then, his senses dimmed and he fell into an absolute silence. At the same time, Qing Sheng also noticed the disappearance of Zhan Yuan, Shunchang, and the others. But he was a person who sought help from the inside, so he didn't feel anything about this. He was only worried about himself. Even though he had thought that there would be no problem as long as he guarded his Taoist heart, the tribulation energy wouldn't be so difficult to deal with if it was that easy. At this moment, he also felt that he couldn't hold on any longer. He pondered for a moment and transmitted his divine will to Huan Tong, saying, "When I enter the silence, you will be the only one left. I hope that you can guard this place and don't let the spirit of creation take advantage of it." Huan Tong replied in a serious tone, "I've been entrusted by the great virtue to guard this place. If there's a dangerous situation, I won't hesitate to stay here." Taoist Qing Xing didn't say anything else and left with his divine will. Huan Tong was still fighting against the Weili. It wasn't difficult for him to sense that after the two of them talked, Qing Sheng's Weili Qi activity was slowly weakening. After holding on for a long time, he couldn't sense it anymore. He looked into the endless silence. From now on, he was the only one left to fight against the spirit of creation's Weili Qi activity. He knew that now was the time of real danger. Without Qing Sheng's threat, the spirit of creation's Weili might push another person to fight against him. He could still manage this place, but apart from this, there was still a huge loophole in the land of creation essence. Even though the spirit of creation's reincarnated body had comprehended its own body and broke free from the true body's control, it might not really be on their side. If another enemy appeared now, and this person took advantage of the spirit of creation's battle to seize the land of creation essence, he wouldn't be able to stop it. Even though this person was no longer the same as the spirit of creation's true body, the Weili left behind by the true body might cooperate. Because from this person's point of view, even if this land fell into the hands of the spirit of creation's reincarnated body, it would be better than falling into the hands of the great virtue. If this person succeeded, then the spirit of creation's true body only needed to place a piece on the chessboard of the great Tao and forcefully merge it. Then, it would be very likely to seize the land of creation essence as well. However, the more one was afraid of something, the more it would happen. He quickly sensed that there was a qi activity rising from the present world. With a thought, he sent his divine will to the Taoist who was hiding in the place where the essence of creation was. He said, "Fellow Taoist, if someone like you appears later, I hope fellow Taoist can help me deal with the enemy." The Taoist said, "If you can't win, I will fight." Huan Tong knew that this was actually a disguised form of rejection, so he didn't get angry at all. Instead, he advised with a calm expression, "Fellow Taoist, I understand what you're thinking. If you can take control of the land of creation essence, it will indeed allow you to avoid danger. However, this place is something that the spirit of creation and the great virtue must obtain. Let me ask you, if you're caught in the middle of the battle, how can you benefit?" The Taoist indeed had such thoughts. Seeing that Huan Tong had exposed the matter, he didn't hide it anymore. He said, "Of course I've thought about what you said, but so what if I stand on the great virtue's side? I'm still a chess piece that can be discarded at any time. My life and death are completely up to the great virtue's will. It's not something I can control. Now that the two sides are fighting, this land of creation essence doesn't belong to anyone. If I can rely on this to take a step forward on my Tao, who knows, I might be blessed by the great virtue, or I might even be able to enter the chessboard." Huan Tong shook his head and said, "Although what you're thinking is reasonable, the chance here is very slim." The Taoist said faintly, "Perhaps so. One must know that if I can seize the chance, I can also achieve Tao. Now that the chance is right in front of me, if I miss it, wouldn't I be abandoning my Tao?" Huan Tong said, "Fellow Taoist thinks there's a chance, but I don't think so. How can there be such a big loophole in the battle between the two sides? It's fine if you don't enter, but once you do, you'll be doomed." The Taoist said, "Although I don't know about the chessboard of the great Tao, I do know that people like us who transcend the world and have our own consciousness, as long as we're not restrained by others, aren't people that can be easily controlled by a single chess piece. I've already proven myself, and my mind and body are one. How can it be so easy to devour me?" Huan Tong said slowly, "Although your cultivation is enough, you've suddenly ascended, so your state of mind is lacking. You might not be able to resist your main body's invasion." The Taoist hesitated for a moment, but he immediately became determined. He said, "I've already made up my mind, so there's no need for you to persuade me anymore. Right now, you can't even take care of yourself, so it's best if you don't mind my business." After saying this, his spirit intent disappeared without a trace. Huan Tong shook his head. He just now said that the great virtue had set up something in the all things. Although it was only his guess, if even he could think of it, how could the great virtue really reveal this loophole? Since persuasion was useless, and he didn't have the power to make enemies on both sides, then he didn't need to worry about it anymore. He just needed to do what he needed to do. After the Taoist severed the connection between his spirit intent and Huan Tong's, he prepared to use the essence of creation to enter the second gate. However, this matter was easy to say, but it was far from as simple as he made it out to be. However, he noticed that when he faced the main whaley this time, he actually didn't encounter any obstruction. In fact, wherever his spirit intent spread, the whaley would automatically retreat, as if it was actively cooperating with his invasion. Seeing this, not only did he not feel happy, his heart sank instead. All of this was undoubtedly as Huan Tong had said. The spirit of creation chose to retreat at this moment because it intended to let him take over this place, and in the end, it would probably pluck the fruit from here. At this moment, he had the intention to retreat, but after thinking about it, he still decided to continue. Because this was his only hope in attaining Tao. Even if it was a poisonous bait, he still had to swallow it. Moreover, he didn't believe that if the spirit of creation really did place a chess piece to take him, would the great virtue not do anything to stop it? If the great virtue acted, then this would be his chance. Chapter 23:23. As the power in the present world surged out, Huan Tong abandoned the matter of the Taoist and prepared to focus on dealing with the great enemy in front of him. After all, the person was a threat. It was only after this that he needed to carefully deal with the matter in front of him. As soon as the power appeared in the world, it condensed into a figure. This time, it was an expressionless young cultivator with a cold gaze. Due to the different bodies that the spirits of creation resided in, their appearances were naturally different as well. However, because their chi dynamics worshipped the same Tao technique, they were extremely similar. It was only after they had realized themselves that a change could occur. As soon as the person appeared, he immediately attacked Huan Tong like the last time. After Huan Tong had the previous battle experience, he understood that there was no need for him to overwhelm his opponent. He could not do that either. It was fine as long as he maintained his own existence. He used his mana to block the opponent's attack. At the same time, he consciously transmitted his Dao technique. If he was lucky this time, the opponent would quickly realize the truth. Then this crisis would naturally be resolved. His only worry was that even if this person was blocked, the root of the problem would not be solved. It would be difficult for the matter to end. However, after thinking about it again, even if the spirits of creation Whaley could push people to come up again, it would not be endless due to the obstruction of the primordial jade. His guess was correct. Following the extermination of the world by the Yen sect and the other sects, the Tao of the spirits of creation was greatly suppressed. Due to the rise of spiritual vigor, the situation faced by the cultivators was alleviated. Therefore, the various sects started a series of actions again. There were only two choices made here. A small number of people believed that spiritual vigor could disappear at any time. Therefore, they gathered all the cultivation items that they could find and seized the opportunity to cultivate in order to push the disciples of their sects to break through. On the other hand, the various large sects occupied the rich spiritual vigor everywhere. Even if spiritual vigor declined, there would still be a few places that they could use. However, this method would undoubtedly conflict with the Tao of the spirits of creation. Therefore, these cultivators could barely be considered as the allies of the Yen sect. The bodies of the spirit of creation that had been reincarnated into this world were the first targets to be eliminated. Under the joint efforts of the various sects, especially after the search of the upper realm cultivators, the bodies of the spirit of creation that had been reincarnated into this world were found one after another. They were either eradicated in advance or led to their own paths by the various sections. This time, Huan Tong's performance under the opponent's fierce attacks was even steadier than last time. The dangerous situations he had encountered before didn't appear again. In the past, he had been very respectful towards the spirit of creation, but after exchanging blows, this feeling had decreased a lot. It was not that he had underestimated his opponent, but that he was facing the spirit of creation, Whaley. This kind of opponent did not have his own consciousness. It was only because his level was extremely high that he would make a reasonable response to things that were not beneficial to him. In fact, he could actually predict every step he took. The only thing he lacked was sufficient strength to deal with it. However, one could only do as much as one's strength. Zhang Yan did not ask him to do things that were beyond his ability. If he cast aside the many unclear loopholes, it would be relatively easy to deal with it. In the land of the essence of creation, the Taoist retreated in the face of the original Whaley. He simply let go and continued to snatch the land of creation that had been combined, but was not as good as the combined Whaley of the two sides. However, if it was just for the sake of reaching the second realm, it was very possible for him to achieve it with a little effort. Now that the essence of creation had been combined, even if the original portion of Bu Su Tian and the Mirror Lake was removed, the remaining essence of creation was enough to push him forward. However, if he wanted to become a great virtue and be the person who held the pieces on the chessboard, it was not that simple. Even he himself was a little worried about his gains and losses. Huan Tong's words still had some impact on him after all. Those Taoist cultivators who cultivated properly were either born with a firm and steady Taoist heart, or each of them had experienced countless hardships. As long as it was something they were determined to do, they would not be swayed by a few words from others. However, he was different. From the beginning, he was a person who worshipped Taoism. Other than himself, he did not care about anything else. He was completely pushed forward by Taoism. Before he found his original heart, his memories were blank. Although he had seized the opportunity to climb up, it was inevitable that he would have doubts about himself. He had to comfort himself that the path of Tao was just ahead. Since he had already made a decision, he had offended both sides. Now, he could only continue moving forward. There was no turning back. Just as his thoughts were fluctuating, he sensed waves of Whaley colliding from outside. He immediately knew that another of his kind had come out to compete with the cultivator of human path. His spirit was lifted. Now, there was really no one to restrain him. Without this worry, he devoted himself wholeheartedly. His chi activity began to rise rapidly. Based on this trend, it would not be long before he could enter the second realm. At this moment, Zhang Yan was still deducing Taoism and fighting for the initiative with the spirit of creation. The confrontation here wasn't like the tribulation energy from before. Both sides were moving towards the final Tao art, so both sides had fallen into a dense fog. Until the final moment arrived, no one was able to sense exactly what sort of level the other had attained. Occasionally, he would observe the situation within all you. However, under the obstruction of the tribulation power, his senses were getting weaker and weaker. Now, there was only a slight connection. However, he had already made all the arrangements. If nothing unexpected happened, he would at least be able to maintain a stalemate before the outcome of the tribulation power Taoism was decided. At this moment, he suddenly felt a whaley coming over. When he looked over, he saw that the tribulation power around him had suddenly parted. He saw Ancestor Hong Bo and Ancestor Yao Han coming over together. He was slightly moved and said, "Fellow Taoists, why have you come over? Did something happen?" The tribulation power had cut off the connection between them and all you. It was even difficult to communicate with each other through their divine wills. However, it was impossible to stop the spirit of creation. Ancestor Yao Han smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, we have seen your move in all you. If the heavenly secret is impartial, then it can indeed block the spirit of creation's sneaky scheme. However, after discussing it, we feel that under the change of the great Tao, it is difficult for anyone to predict the changes. So, we need to interfere." Ancestor Hong Bo raised his voice and said, "Although we are surrounded by the tribulation power now, I have a method. I can use my sword to cut the tribulation power and leave a strand of chi activity within all you. This way, even if the spirit of creation emerges, we can still kill it." Zhang Yan knew that this founding ancestor's Tao technique was unique, and his sword technique was peerlessly sharp. Back then, when he was trapped within the tribulation energy, he was still able to form a clone within the tribulation energy, so he didn't doubt his words at all. He didn't hold back before this founding ancestor and said, "Since fellow Taoist has this technique, then please do it." Ancestor Hong Bo nodded and immediately raised his hand. With a wave of his sleeve, a ray of sword light flew out and cut through the tribulation power, heading straight for all you. As soon as the sword light arrived, it turned into the figure of a sword-wielding Taoist, and it flew toward where Huan Tong and the young cultivator were fighting. Huan Tong was currently at a disadvantage. He found that the enemy this time was different from the last time. Even though their magic power clashed and they had an exchange of Tao, after fighting for so long, this person was still unmoved and hadn't realized his true self. However, Huan Tong could still hold his ground for now. Right at this moment, he sensed a sharp aura charging towards him. The young cultivator had sensed it as well and seemed to think that the newcomer was a threat to him. He didn't pay any attention to Huan Tong and instead used all his Wei to suppress the newcomer. A ray of bright sword light suddenly flashed through the air. The young cultivator's Wei wasn't able to block it at all and was slashed apart like a piece of paper. The ray of sword light took the opportunity to slash his Tao body in half. Huan Tong looked over in surprise and saw a Taoist walk out from the brilliant ray of sword light. The Taoist nodded to him and held the sword in his hand. The Taoist didn't stop and descended into the world. He calmed his mind. That Taoist was undoubtedly the incarnation of a great virtue. Otherwise, it was impossible for a single strike of the young cultivator's Tao body to possess such might. He calmed his mind. That Taoist was undoubtedly the incarnation of a great virtue. Otherwise, it was impossible for a single strike of the young cultivator's Tao body to possess such might. However, he could also sense that just now, the Taoist's aura was extremely strong the moment he appeared. It was almost as if a great virtue was standing in front of him. However, in just a short moment, the Taoist's aura was plummeting. It was obvious that the tribulation power wasn't unaffected by it. At this moment, The Taoist, who was the incarnation of the spirit of creation, had reached the second stage steadily. It seemed like he wasn't far from becoming a great virtue. He was also full of ambition at this moment. At the same time, a strange enlightenment surged into his mind. He thought to himself, all the great cultivators in the world have their own names, but the name I used earlier wasn't my own name. I should choose a name so that I can truly separate from my true body. Just as he was thinking, his heart suddenly palpitated. He looked up and saw a sword-bearing Taoist stepping through the void toward him. He felt a strong threat rushing toward him, and he immediately urged the Whaley to meet it. However, there was only a flash of sword light, and everything in the world was far away from him. After the sword-bearing Taoist swung his sword, he didn't even look at the opponent he had killed. Instead, he turned into a stream of light and merged with the essence of creation. From this moment on, all the incarnations of the spirit of creation that were climbing up from the bottom would run into a layer of obstruction. They would no longer be able to break through the barriers as easily as before. On the great path chessboard, Patriarch Hongbo waited for the incarnation to finish. He said, "The problem has been solved. For now, there's no need to worry about the spirit of creation falling into the world. The Whaley will come out and disrupt the situation." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. Patriarch Yao Han smiled and said, "The spirit of creation has his own methods. Fellow Taoist Shen Yuan, I believe that regardless of whether he can obtain the Taoist art or not, he may leave behind a piece to separate us from the Whaley. If we make a mistake, we may be forced into eternal silence." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, you're right. However, he can plot against me, and I can plot against him. Right now, we have the upper hand in this chess game. If he's willing to stay and fight with me, that's exactly what I want." Chapter 23-24. Huan Tong waited for a long time. When he saw that there were no more creation spirit Whaley appearing, he could not help but feel much more relaxed. He did not wait here in vain. In the void, he was the only spirit refinement cultivator who was not affected by the power of tribulation, so the heavy responsibility of fighting against the creation spirit Whaley fell on him. Therefore, he sank into the land of essence of creation and cooperated with Zhang Yan Whaley to continue fighting against the corrosion of this power. He waited for the battle between the Vedanta and the creation spirit to be decided. In the various worlds, the Tao inheritance of the creation spirit was previously besieged by the cultivators of the various worlds, causing its power to be greatly reduced. Here, the body of the creation spirit was specially targeted. No matter how fast this generation of cultivators cultivated, they still needed a place where there were no external disturbances to cultivate. Now, under the joint search of a group of supreme cultivators, they were often killed before they could even reach the upper realm. As for those who escaped the purge, they also found that their cultivation was not as smooth as before, because their qi activity was obstructed by Ancestor Hongba's sword qi, and their path of ascension had become extremely difficult. If it were not for the fact that almost all the land of essence of creation that was continuously coming in were occupied by the Tao inheritance of the creation spirit, the situation would be very clear. However, the creation spirit Whaley was suppressed, but it did not mean that it was submissive. The upper realm could not win the battle for the time being, so it transferred all the pressure to the lower realm. Under the cover of the Great One Divine Pearl, the creation spirit Whaley could not directly destroy the living beings of the various worlds, but it could push more of the creation spirit Tao to fight against the latter. If it could destroy all living beings, it could also achieve its goal. Both the upper and lower worlds were involved in this battle, suppressing it in certain aspects. However, if it was not destroyed, it would only be released in another place, and it would not disappear on its own. When all the creation spirit Whaley exerted its power to the lower realm, the effect it could exert was great. Previously, most of its power was used to push the body of the creation spirit to the upper realm, and it rarely paid attention to other places. Under such influence, the advancement of the human Tao was immediately obstructed, and the creation spirit Tao inheritance that was originally forced back spread even faster than before. If the previous momentum was just a wave, then the current one was a tsunami and a landslide. At this moment, the people that Zhang Yan had planted in the various worlds were still cultivating according to the usual routine. No one had suddenly transcended. After all, he had planted these seeds just in case. As long as there was no opponent that Huan Tong could not deal with, there was no need to push someone to fill the gap. Although everyone had a sliver of heaven's will to reach the Tao, finding it by oneself and being promoted by others were completely different. The day the latter achieved the Tao was the day of the end of one's Tao. This was because, apart from the person who originally guided you, you would never be able to rely on your own strength to cultivate to the highest realm. Although many people did not care about this and felt that the opportunity to ascend to the heavens in a single step was already extremely good, when they truly ascended to this realm, they might not think so anymore. On the contrary, they might even feel resentful. Zhang Yan didn't care about all of this, but he felt that if it wasn't really necessary, this generation's Tao karma should be obtained by themselves and not cut off by him. In the Bai Luo heaven, Fu Qingming was currently frowning. As the two reincarnated bodies transcended and left, they temporarily had no opponents at the true yang level. However, there was now an invisible barrier between them and the various worlds, making it impossible for them to communicate with the lower realms. Now, it wasn't just the human Dao Yuan Zun, even the Khanate demons and extraterrestrial demons were the same. They had completely lost contact with the lower realms. However, Bai Wei, Deng Zhang, and even the demon masters did not care about this. This was because the realms under their jurisdiction were far inferior to the human Dao. Together, they were only a few realms. Even if the creation spirit Dao technique invaded, they had nothing to be reluctant about. At worst, they could just abandon it and open it up again. At this moment, Michihito Ichido transmitted his divine will. Fellow Taoist, don't worry. As long as there are no true yang beings interfering with the lower realms, I believe that the human Dao cultivators can rely on their own abilities to fight against the creation spirit Dao technique. Fu Qingming nodded and said, I think so too. This barrier can seal us off, but with Xianyuan Grand Weili there, it can't seal the door to the human Dao cultivators' advancement. This battle is destined to be difficult for him to win. In a certain realm in the current realm, Renji wore a tattered robe. His face was somewhat dull as he sat in front of a straw hut. In the distance, a few children and teenagers were throwing stones and mud at him while shouting, "Silly man, silly man." In this life, he was born with a blocked spiritual aperture and behaved foolishly. However, he was born with a strong body, so other than some naughty children, no one dared to bully him. Other than working, he ate, drank, and slept every day. Until half a year ago, countless cultivation techniques suddenly appeared in his mind. In his muddle-headed state, he unconsciously cultivated according to them. His mind was pure and untainted by any worldly thoughts. As he cultivated, his heart and Tao became one, and he improved every day. But at that moment he had opened his spiritual aperture in one go. In that instant, the stiff and honest expression on his face had completely disappeared, and his eyes revealed a trace of liveliness. He clapped his hands, picked up a straw rope, and tied his long hair behind his head. He stood up and walked into the straw hut. The group of children and youths who were previously fooling around suddenly quietened down. In their eyes, Renji seemed to have transformed into a completely different person, and was no longer the simple-minded person that they could bully as they wished. Renji walked into the straw hut and gently shook his shoulders. The dirt and dust on his body slid off, revealing his smooth, jade-like skin. The bugs and lice on his body, as well as the mosquitoes and flies in the straw hut, all fled from him as if they had met their natural enemy. He was not surprised by all these abnormalities. He changed into a clean set of clothes and walked out again. Looking at the vast world outside, he said, "I should first learn how to read and write." Although he had opened his spiritual aperture and obtained Tao techniques, the first thing he needed to do was to read. This was also a must. Those simple breathing techniques might be able to be learned by illiterate people, but if he wanted to go further, Tao techniques must be explained using the principles and words of the world. Even though he had Zhang Yan's guidance, it was only to remove the obstacles on his path of cultivation. He still had to walk his own path. When Renji left, he quickly learned how to write, but he did not rush to embark on the path of cultivation. Instead, he spent several years visiting famous teachers and exchanging knowledge. Because of his reputation, he was even recognized by others and was appointed as a senior official. Another year later, he bid farewell and left. Then he found a cave abode on a high mountain to cultivate. Because Zhang Yan had given him a strand of dermic powers, it was enough to replace the complicated external objects of cultivation. The time needed to search for external objects was saved. If there were no external disturbances, then he could continue to cultivate until he reached the level of transcending the heavens and earth. However, the Tao teachings of the spirit of creation quickly spread to his place of cultivation. Under the Whaley's push, it became very aggressive and hostile to cultivators. As the two sides fought, the originally prosperous world of the human path was in ruins. The human path cultivators of the inner realm were also forced to retreat and were on the verge of collapse. After Renji sensed this situation, he had no choice but to stop his closed-door cultivation and stand out to fight. In the end, he slowly turned the situation around. During this period of time, he even received help from the Yen sect. After talking with the disciples of the Yen sect, he greatly approved of the actions of the Yen sect and became a wandering cultivator to serve the Yen sect. From then on, he was no longer cultivating alone. Instead, he constantly took out his comprehension and shared it with many of his fellow Taoists. After spending hundreds of years in this chaotic war, he and his fellow Taoists had finally eliminated the inheritance of the spirit of creation in this world. After that, for the sake of fulfilling his Tao heart, he'd broken through space and continued to head to the myriad of worlds to fight his enemies. At this moment, he didn't know that even though those cultivators that had received guidance from Zhang Yan like him weren't able to advance to a higher realm of cultivation, most of them were like him, and they'd become pillars of support to resist the inheritance of the spirit of creation Tao. On the Grand Tao chessboard, Zhang Yan's gaze flickered slightly after he went through another round of deduction, and a feeling arose in his heart that it wasn't long before he would be able to see this technique. If there weren't too many variables, he would be able to obtain this Tao method before the spirit of creation. Just at this moment, he saw movement from the chessboard that hadn't moved for a long time. He understood that the spirit of creation must have noticed that the Tao method behind the tribulation power was very likely to be taken away by him, so it made another move. However, after a short while, he realized that he couldn't sense the spirit of creation's Whaley anymore. It was as if it had completely disappeared from his senses. He nodded to himself. Sure enough, founding ancestor Hongba was right. Back then, the various great virtues didn't fall into eternal silence while being surrounded by the tribulation power. That was because they used their own resistance against the spirit of creation and clung onto his Whaley, so they didn't fall into oblivion. Yet now, the spirit of creation had used the chess piece to completely separate his Whaley from them. After all, they were still surrounded by the tribulation power. If they couldn't obtain the complete Tao method before the tribulation power drove them into eternal silence, then not only would the Tao method not belong to them, they might not even be able to maintain their own existence. He smiled. This was most likely what the spirit of creation had planned before throwing out the tribulation power. However, he had also told ancestor Yao Han that if the spirit of creation could scheme against them, then he could do the same to the spirit of creation. He pointed with a finger and also placed a chess piece on the chessboard. This move directly severed the connection between the spirit of creation's Whaley and the fragment of the spirit of creation. The spirit of creation could be linked to the chi activity of all things precisely because there were countless fragments of the spirit of creation within all things. Now that this connection had been severed, it wouldn't be able to maintain its position under the suppression of the tribulation power. Thus, with this step, both the spirit of creation and the great virtues could be said to have separated themselves from all things. If they weren't careful, then they could both fall into eternal silence. Chapter 23-25. At this moment, whether it was the Vedanta side or the spirit of creation's true body, they all felt that they were rapidly slipping into eternal silence. If they wanted to reverse the situation, Perhaps they could only place their pieces on the chessboard of the Great Path. But for some reason, even after a long time, neither side made the slightest move. At the same time, many true yang cultivators in the world felt that the barrier in front of them had also become thinner. In the Bai Luo heaven, Fu Qingming had been staring at the barrier for a long time. At this moment, when he felt this situation, he lowered his head and thought for a moment. When he raised his head again, his expression had become solemn. He mobilized all the magic power in his body and slammed it against the barrier. With a loud bang, he felt his spirit and celestial body receive waves of recoil, and his aura fluctuated unsteadily. However, it did not mean that he did not gain anything, because he realized that this was probably not something that could be penetrated by magic power alone. Perhaps he had to rely on his willpower more. He immediately sat down cross-legged and made up his mind to descend into the human world. In the beginning, he only felt that he had encountered many obstacles, and it was almost impossible to move an inch. But as he continued to work hard, he finally sensed the clamor from the human world. Although it was still very weak, it undoubtedly proved that his thoughts were correct. In fact, no matter how much the spirit of creation's Weili was weakened, it was not something that a true yang cultivator could resist. What they encountered now was the same as the Tao inheritance. It was just a concrete manifestation of its will that had descended into the world. Now, only the Weili that Zhang Yan had left in Busha Heaven was truly fighting against it. But because both sides had endless Weili, no matter which side had the upper hand, it was impossible to destroy the other side. Moreover, both sides could be said to be evenly matched. But after the addition of the robbery power, the situation was very different. This was a power that could truly Weili the spirit of creation. It could be said that as long as the spirit of creation had no way to retaliate, its influence on the world would gradually weaken until it disappeared. After several attempts, Fu Qingming confirmed that he could make a breakthrough here. Then, he activated his divine will and linked up with the rest of the people path Yuanzun. Then, he said solemnly, "I don't know why, but the force that's blocking me from the outside has weakened. Just now, I've already tried. As long as I use my divine will to guide me, I can break through this barrier and enter the human world. However, I've noticed that the spirit of creation Tao teachings are overflowing and spreading. If we don't pay attention to it, the sects might not be able to contain it with their own strength. I think there's no harm in sending my divine will to the human world to reduce this Tao teachings." Of course, he couldn't do anything to the creation spirit Weili directly, but he could kill the living being that had received the creation spirit's teachings. Originally, true yang cultivators could make everything beneficial to themselves, and it was easy for them to change the state of mind of these living beings. Unfortunately, all of this was useless under the influence of the will of the creation spirit, so they could only use more intense methods. In any case, from his point of view, as long as one embarked on the Tao path of worshipping the spirit of creation, one would no longer be a person of the human path. Michihito Ichido was the first to agree. "I think so too. Now that the creation spirit's power has retreated, it must be the great virtues who have the upper hand. We need to take this opportunity to sweep away the creation spirit's teachings in the various worlds to prevent any changes in the situation." Lu Lin, Qin Shan, Mo Tsang, and Han Xiao discussed for a while, then nodded and said, "That's how it should be." Fu Qingming looked at Taoist Juan Quebec. At this moment, he was the only one who hadn't expressed his opinion. He was the one with the highest cultivation among them. If he was willing to contribute, the chances of success would be higher. Taoist Juan K said expressionlessly, "I have no objections." Seeing that everyone was in agreement, Fu Qingming didn't want to miss the opportunity. He immediately retreated from the divine will and tried to break through the barrier with his mental strength. Perhaps it was because the power of the spirit of creation was still declining, but this time, it was much easier than the last time. Soon, his aura permeated the heavens and realms, and then he began to wipe out the living beings who worshipped the spirit of creation. The other true yang cultivators, Yuanzun, did the same. Although Taoist Juan K was doing the same, he didn't think that it would be of much use. At that time, he'd almost stepped into the spirit refinement realm. Even though he'd retreated in the end, he was very clearly aware that no matter how vast the magic energy of a true Yang realm cultivator was and was capable of enveloping the myriad of worlds, it could only be utilized within a single world in the end, and it was utterly insufficient when compared to the myriad of worlds. But he also understood that even though doing this wouldn't be of much use, even the cultivators of the various worlds were trying their best to resist the invasion of the creation spirit, so he didn't have the face to stay out of it. Although Fu Qingming didn't have the cultivation of Taoist 1K, with Dan Yi's help, he saw the struggle on the chessboard of the Great Tao, and his vision was no longer limited to the true Yang level. He naturally knew that it was useless to just eliminate the creation spirit's Tao technique in one world. But it wasn't that there was no way here. After all, the evolution sect possessed the realm gate. Now, with every additional land of creation, a realm gate would be born. So he wanted to go to those worlds through this. If everything went as he thought, then he could destroy all the creation spirit's teachings. But when he tried, he realized that these realm gates were easy for ordinary cultivators to pass through, but it was difficult for cultivators at his level to pass through easily. If he forced it, it would disperse a portion of its power, and it wouldn't be unharmed. But even so, he was willing to do so. After informing Michito Ichito and the others, he decided to cross over to the other side of the realm gate. After placing the chess piece, Zhang Yan allowed the tribulation power to surge up his body, and he didn't make any other moves. He just calculated with all his heart. At this moment, he realized that he had touched upon a trace of profundity, and he knew that success was imminent. He raised his head to look at the other side of the chessboard of the Great Tao. Because the connection between them and the creation spirit was severed, they didn't have the slightest sense of the creation spirit at this moment, and they didn't know what method they would use to deal with this situation. Founding ancestor Yao Han seemed to have guessed his thoughts and said, "Fellow Taoist, the Weili has been severed, and it's naturally difficult for me to know what the creation spirit is planning. But I have a method that can see through the void and discern the situation on the other side." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Go ahead, fellow Taoist." Founding ancestor Yao Han raised his sleeve and pointed at the sky. A ray of starlight shone down and landed on the chessboard of the Great Tao. In an instant, everything was illuminated, and only the area where the creation spirit was isolated from the Weili by the rules of the Great Tao was exposed to the void. Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows, and the creation spirit didn't seem to have any reaction. But the more it didn't move, the more it meant that it had a backup plan. He had once thought about whether he should put on an appearance of dragging the creation spirit into the void with him at all costs. This way, he could force the creation spirit to place his chess piece and continue to consume the Tao technique he had. But after thinking about it carefully, the creation spirit probably wouldn't fall for it, and he wouldn't do that either. He was seeking the Tao, not the void. And when he stood up to preside over the situation, it was no longer his own matter. He also had to take into account the interests of his fellow Taoists. Those great virtues gave up their Tao techniques and would rather be devoured by the creation spirit for the sake of the overall situation, so he naturally couldn't let them down. Moreover, he was about to obtain the Tao technique behind the tribulation energy very soon. At that time, he would naturally be able to utilize the tribulation energy to oppress the creation spirit openly, and there was no need for him to make risky moves. At this moment, Hong Ho and Yao Han didn't speak or move, and they waited at the side for the outcome. After Zhang Yan sat upright for a long time, a dim light arose in his eyes, and then he just shook his sleeve and easily withdrew the tribulation energy that enveloped his body. At this moment he'd successfully obtained this Tao technique. Now, not only did he not have to resist the tribulation energy, he could utilize it at will to deal with his enemies. Not only that, without the obstruction of the tribulation energy, he could send his Weili deep into the place where the creation essence resided and expel the creation spirit from the Weili. Moreover, he could refine this place as well, and once all the creation essence was combined together, he would be able to obtain this place as well. However, he understood that he couldn't relax now. The creation spirit was far from losing the ability to fight back, so he immediately activated the tribulation energy to suppress the creation spirit. When Hong Ho and Yao Han saw this scene, their spirits rose. Since they'd entered the Grand Tao chessboard until now, this was the first time they'd seen a chance to win. With the Tao technique of tribulation energy in hand, he could isolate the creation spirit from everything at any time. If he added in the place where the creation essence resided, then with these two chess pieces in hand he wouldn't even need to use the Grand Tao chessboard. With the creation spirit's Weili being greatly suppressed at this moment, it was extremely likely that he would be able to defeat it. At this moment, the creation spirit didn't place a chess piece on the Grand Tao chessboard. Instead, with a flash of light, a mysterious presence appeared. Then, it connected with Zhang Yan's Weili once more. Under the pressure of the tribulation energy, the creation spirit's figure became solid once more. Zhang Yan's gaze flickered. Even with his current cultivation, the moment the presence appeared, he felt a profound and unfathomable feeling. Ancestor Hongho's gaze sharpened. This is the creation chi. Ancestor Yao Han frowned. This person must have grasped a portion of the creation chi and used it to implicate us Weili. I didn't expect him to be able to use this chi. I wonder if this change happened after he devoured a few fellow Taoists, or if he had obtained a portion long ago. At this point he shook his head with a smile. No wonder he hasn't moved. So he's fearless and has schemed against us. Back then, Ancestor Tai Ming had used the creation chi and the force of great virtue. Just now, he had suppressed a portion of the creation spirit's power. This also contained the presence of Ancestor Hongho and Patriarch Tai Ming. It was equivalent to the creation spirit taking this opportunity to reconnect with them. As long as the two of them didn't fall into eternal silence, the creation spirit wouldn't fall into it either. Ancestor Hongho looked at Zhang Yan and said sternly, "Fellow Taoist Xinyuan, if you let us fall into eternal silence, the creation spirit will also be brought in. This is the best time to eliminate him." Please remember this book's domain name. 9 Heavens Shenhuang mobile version website. Chapter 23-26. When Zhang Yan heard Patriarch Hongho's words, he gave it some thought and rejected the suggestion. The spirit of creation had used a wisp of chi of creation to bind the two Weili patriarchs. It seemed that he could only rely on these two to resist the power of calamity. However, he believed that the spirit of creation would not put all his eggs in one basket. There must be a backup plan for defense. Moreover, even if it came to the most critical moment, the spirit of creation could use a Tao technique to save the situation. He also understood Patriarch Hongho's thoughts. The spirit of creation could place a piece to protect himself, but he could also place a piece to eliminate it. He could even use the advantage he had accumulated previously on this. In this way, the spirit of creation might not be able to resist. However, he needed to pay attention to one thing. In this way, the spirit of creation would also be able to free the Vedanta Weili from the suppression. Although the spirit of creation might not be able to immediately break free from the suppression, the power of calamity that he controlled might not be able to force it into eternal silence before that. Moreover, it was difficult to say whether the spirit of creation had done this on purpose. Therefore, this method was still too risky. Putting all these aside, this battle was a battle between the Vedanta of human Tao and the spirit of creation for survival. At the same time, it was also a battle of seeking Tao for both sides. Only the side that truly won could climb to the upper realm. If the spirit of creation was driven into eternal silence just like that, then even the chi of creation and all the Vedanta would not return. In this way, the Tao that he was seeking would be incomplete. He had a feeling that if he really did that, then it would be very difficult for him to find the path to the upper realm. Therefore, only a complete victory could complete the Tao. After thinking about it, he voiced his opinion to the two patriarchs. The two patriarchs Yao Han and Hongho did not continue to insist. At this moment, they only suggested it because they saw a chance to win. Zhang Yan was the one in charge, so no matter what choice he made, they were willing to accept it. Zhang Yan didn't continue on this topic when he saw this, and he asked about something else instead. He said, "Just now, I've sensed that as soon as that strand of creation energy appeared, the obstruction of the tribulation energy towards him has instantly decreased. Fellow Taoists, Do you know what profundities this energy possesses? Ancestral Master Yao Han pondered for a moment and said, when this qi came out, it was taken by fellow Taoist Tai Ming and the others to suppress the creation spirit. The two of us didn't have much contact with this qi, but from what I know, this qi seems to be able to communicate with one's mind and soul formation transformation. That's probably why the creation spirit wanted to keep this qi even though it knew that part of its power would be sealed. Zhang Yan's mind spun. Simply put, the so-called connecting one's mind and transforming one's soul actually meant that one's wishes would come true. When he was in the true yang stage, he was able to achieve what he wanted, but just now, he was powerless against the same level of power. But from Ancestral Master Yao Han's tone, the creation qi seemed to be able to be used on Vedanta, which was very impressive. But at the same time, he also noticed that the creation qi should be very difficult to control. Otherwise, Ancestral Master Tai Ming would not have needed to gather the power of Vedanta to suppress a part of the creation spirit's power. From this, it could be inferred that a small amount of creation qi might be able to be used by one person, but when there was a large amount, it would be difficult to do so. Ancestral Master Hongba then said, it's very likely that the creation spirit has already refined a part of the creation qi, but it has been hiding it all this time. Just now, fellow Taoist is suppressing it with the tribulation energy, and just now, it's forced to use it. Zhang Yan nodded in agreement. From what the two ancestral masters said, the creation qi was very important. If used at a critical moment, it would undoubtedly be able to reverse the situation, and it would not be an exaggeration to say that it could determine success or failure. Although the creation spirit had saved the situation, on the surface, it did not seem to have played a very big role. Moreover, the fact that it had been leaked in advance had made them take precautions. It was very likely that the creation qi had sensed the threat on the chessboard and was afraid that it would not be enough to deal with the subsequent games, so it had chosen to use the creation qi just now. At this time, Ancestral Master Hongbo reminded, the use of the creation qi might be more than what we have said. Fellow Taoist Xinyuan, you need to be careful when you come down. Zhang Yan pondered for a while. As the saying goes, one should not underestimate the enemy. It was difficult for him to figure out what the creation spirit was thinking. It might be that the creation qi that the creation spirit had mastered was only a small amount, so it could not do too much. Therefore, it used it here, which would make them even more wary. However, no matter what the creation spirit did, he only needed to steadily advance here without too many loopholes. No matter what kind of killing move the creation spirit had, he would be able to see it later. After these thoughts passed through his mind, he focused on the creation essence. Although the creation spirit could use the creation qi to reconnect with the two ancestral masters, the connection between the creation spirit and all things had been completely severed by the robbery power. It could be said that if there was no other way to break through, then it would not be long before he could completely take over this land. However, he did not let his guard down. No one knew how much creation qi the creation spirit had. This qi was very mysterious, and it might be able to bypass the robbery power and affect these lands of creation. Even if it did not use this item, as long as the creation spirit was still on the chessboard of the Great Path, it could still use its pieces to obstruct him. Before he succeeded, he had to be extra careful. As he thought about it, the lands of creation were merged in, and he gradually refined these lands into his own. As for the Tao competition that was going on in the various worlds, he did not care too much about it. All of this would be resolved by the human path cultivators themselves. Now, all the paths, skills, and opportunities were in the midst of battle. If he interfered, he would be able to settle things once and for all, but at the same time, he would also take away the opportunities that many people should have obtained. While he focused his attention here, the two ancestral masters Yao Han and Hong Ho were staring at the creation spirit, guarding against the creation spirit. However, as the lands of creation were about to fall into their hands, there was no movement on the other side of the chessboard of the Great Path. The two of them could not help but feel suspicious. If all the lands of creation were combined, the Whaley's power would be unimaginable. Even if it could not compare to the complete lands of creation, as long as it had a fraction of its power, It would be enough to face the creation spirit head-on, so there was no reason for the creation spirit to ignore it. Ancestral Master Yao Han said, if the creation spirit still does not move at the moment when the lands of creation are about to be decided, then there must be something more important than obtaining the lands of creation. Ancestral Master Hong Ho immediately pointed out the pros and cons and said, the only thing that can compare to the creation spirit is the creation chi. Ancestral Master Yao Han laughed and said, that's right. Perhaps just now, that wisp of chi not only wants to reconnect with us Wei-Li, but also wants to dissolve the Wei-Li that we have suppressed. Both of them knew that the creation spirit sat on the chessboard of the Great Path to dissolve the Wei-Li that the Vedanta had placed in the creation chi. Once it succeeded, it could break free from the suppression of the creation chi and release the suppressed power. Ancestral Master Hong Ho said decisively, if that's the case, we cannot let it succeed. When the creation spirit was at its peak, no one could resist its Wei-Li divine ability. Only by gathering all the Vedanta might they have a chance to fight it. As for the likes of Glimmer and Xiangjue, they were almost immediately devoured. If the creation spirit recovered its original strength, even if they had the advantage on the chessboard of the Great Path, they might not be able to win. Even more troublesome was that without the Vedanta's Wei-Li suppression, the creation chi could very likely be seized by the creation spirit. Once things developed to this point, there was almost no hope of defeating this enemy. Ancestral Master Yao Han thought for a moment and said, let's tell fellow Taoist Xinyuan about this and let him decide what to do. Ancestral Master Hong Ho also nodded. Although they had placed themselves in the position of chess pieces and were prepared to sacrifice themselves at any time, if Zhang Yan, the leader, did not agree, they could not act as they wished. They had to think of the bigger picture. Moreover, they did not know much about the creation chi. Just now, what they said was only their guesses and could not be confirmed. The two did not delay and immediately contacted Zhang Yan with their divine wills and told him their speculations. After Zhang Yan heard this deduction, he began to ponder in his heart. If it was really as the two patriarchs had said, the only way to stop the spirit of creation was to defeat it now. This was clearly impossible. Acting rashly would instead cause them to panic. Moreover, he believed that even if this was the case, the creation spirit would not be able to do it immediately. There should even be some kind of restriction. Otherwise, why would the creation chi be used to implicate the two ancestral masters? Wouldn't it be better to directly dissolve the Wei-Li in his body? Therefore, he decided to not do anything for the time being. He would wait until he completely grasped the land of creation essence before dealing with this matter. After thinking for a while, he turned his attention back to the various worlds. After his original Wei-Li joined in, the creation spirit's Wei-Li was gradually eliminated by him. As the creation essence under his rule increased, when the land of creation was taken in, he did not even need to take the initiative to refine it. It would automatically fuse with him and become one. After a long time, the two ancestral masters Yao Han and Hong, he seemed to have sensed something and looked at the various worlds at the same time. They saw that the last land of creation had also been merged. At this moment, only the land of creation essence was left in the various worlds. This scene was like the reappearance of the creation essence. However, they knew that no matter how they looked at it, this place could not compare to the true creation essence. However, they had broken through this place in order to see the true Tao. Now, it seemed that they were getting closer and closer to their goal. Zhang Yan's consciousness was currently immersed in the essence of creation. During the refinement process earlier, he'd been constantly on guard against the spirit of creation's attacks. But perhaps everything was as they'd guessed, or perhaps the spirit of creation felt that it was unable to stop them now, so it didn't make a move to stop him even after he'd taken this place for himself. A thought flashed through his mind. It seemed that the spirit of creation had placed the victory of this battle on the creation chi. Because apart from this item, there was nothing else that could contend against the land of creation essence after the fusion. Chapter 23-27. Zhang Yan's divine will circled the land of creation essence once. This place had become his private property. Whether the worlds should stay or move, whether they should change or not, all of it was up to him. Owning this place was not only an additional help, but it also pushed him one step closer to the end of the Grand Tao. However, although this place was one, he could feel that this place was not perfect. He didn't know where there was still a bit of disharmony. There should still be some lingering problems that had not been resolved. For example, the Tao inheritance of the spirit of creation had not been completely cleared. Even if it was very subtle to him, he could still sense it. There were also some remnants of the spirit of creation's Weili struggling to resist when it was expelled. However, when he looked deeper, he found that there was more to it. He calculated for a bit and smiled, preparing to deal with it later. At this time, with a thought, all the Weili here were lifted up by him like a rising tide. The next moment, they sank back down according to his will. There was no hindrance in this process, and it was as if they were one with his own Weili. If he hid here, the enemy would not be able to break in unless they had the Weili that could destroy the land of creation essence. However, from the Weili that the spirit of creation was displaying, it was clear that this person did not have this ability. However, it was hard to estimate what the Weili was like when it was at its peak. Even the two ancestral masters could not show it in their divine will, so he could not come to a conclusion. It was just that although this land of creation essence had been gathered together, it was no longer the original creation essence. Since it was now in his hands, then it should have a name. He thought about it. Previously, on his path of Tao, he had borrowed the power of Bu Su Tian and used it as a stepping stone to climb up. After all, this place was formed with Bu Su Tian as the core, so it was better to call it Bu Su Tian. While he was sorting out this place, there were also changes in the world. The spirit of creation's Weili was expelled. Although the traces left behind in the past had not faded, it was already water without a source. Without the external force to push it forward, its momentum immediately disappeared. After the land of creation essence merged together, the collision between the Vedanta and the spirit of creation's Weili could no longer affect this place. This caused the momentum of spiritual opportunity to not be interrupted. Most importantly, under the lead of a group of powerful cultivators, the cultivators of human path knew how dangerous the spirit of creation's Tao was. No matter which sect, they were all trying to eliminate it. Within the Yen sect's headquarters, Gao Qingtu suddenly noticed that the law inheritance tablet that had already dimmed down was glowing once more. The figures of the three great virtues were still there, and he couldn't help but feel refreshed. Even though Yen sect opened up territories everywhere and never stopped at any time, it was also under a lot of pressure. Especially when the spirit of creation's Weili cast most of its power into the land of creation, it had a great impact on the lower levels. At that time, Yen sect lost many territories in succession, and even many of the branches that had been operating for many years had fallen. The disciples of the sect were even more severely injured. If it was not for a group of elders from the headquarters being sent out to hold the fort in time, the situation would probably be difficult to stabilize. At this moment, when the elders saw the scene on the tablet, they were also extremely happy. In their opinion, the Vedanta sitting on the chessboard of the Great Path didn't seem to be less than before. At the very least, they didn't suffer any losses in the battle with the spirit of creation. After Gao Qingtu's joy, he quickly calmed down. Looking at the map, he considered it thoroughly in his heart. Then he looked at the elders and said in a loud voice, "Although the general trend is in our favor now, we must not let our guard down. As long as there are still spirit of creation's Tao in this world, and there are still human path domains that our disciples of Yen sect haven't set foot in, then our Yen sect must not stop." When the elders heard this, their expressions were stern, and they responded solemnly. In Bai Luo heaven, Fu Qingming withdrew his magic power. This time, he had forcibly passed through many realm gates and destroyed the spirit of creation's Tao. Although he had purged the poisonous atmosphere on many territories, it had also caused him to lose a lot of magic power. But he didn't care about it. Before doing this, he was only worried that even if he exhausted his power, he wouldn't be able to stop the expansion of the spirit of creation's Tao. Fortunately, as Bu Shutian returned to Zhang Yan's rule, the power of the spirit of creation faded, and the overall situation became clear. Next, there wouldn't be too much of a problem even if he didn't contribute anymore. At this moment he suddenly felt a wave of exhaustion. This was due to the loss of vitality, so it was reflected in his mind. But he didn't completely relax. Although the external power had faded, he had never forgotten the innate demons and extraterrestrial demons. They weren't weak, and he still needed to be wary of them taking advantage of the opportunity to cause trouble. After Zhang Yan thoroughly inspected Bu Shutian, he turned back to the chessboard of the Great Path. His eyes flickered. Now it was time to think of a way to get the spirit of creation off the chessboard of the Great Path. They might be able to defeat the spirit of creation on the chessboard, but the possibility of killing it was not high. Now that they had the power to resist the spirit of creation, the chessboard had become something that bound them. The spirit of creation was willing to go on the chessboard to break free of its shackles. The longer it stayed, the more likely it was that it could use the rules of the Great Path to achieve this goal. Since the side of the great virtue of human path had obtained what they wanted, the most important thing now was to stop the spirit of creation with all their strength. They absolutely couldn't let it have its way. And the simplest way was to form pressure on the chessboard of the Great Path. Ever since he took over the situation, all the pieces on the side of the great virtue of human path had fallen into the hands of everyone. Now, they could find a chance to link up and launch a counterattack against the spirit of creation. However, the advantage on the chessboard was the most threatening before it was used. If it was really used, it wouldn't be that effective, so it was best to use pressure to force it to retreat. This way, the side of the great virtue of human path wouldn't need to pay any price. At this moment he already had a countermeasure. Just as he was about to discuss it with the two ancestors, Hongho and Yaowen, his heart skipped a beat. He felt that he seemed to have overlooked something. After thinking for a moment, his eyes flashed slightly, and he knew where the problem was. Something like the chi of creation could be said to be extremely mysterious, but as a part of the original essence of creation, it was certainly not something that could be used up. Even if the spirit of creation was operating it just now, it couldn't just disappear like that. It was also unlikely that it had been taken back. When Lien Yun used it, they could sense it, so how could there be no movement when it was taken back? Then where exactly did the chi go? In the silence, Huan Tong saw that the turbulent undercurrents under the sky had calmed down and were slowly receding. He also sighed in relief. As someone who had transcended the present world, he could naturally see more than ordinary cultivators. From the reaction of the Weili Qi, it wasn't difficult to deduce that this time, it was Zhang Yan who had taken over this place. In this way, he no longer had to worry about the reincarnation of the spirit of creation coming out from it. Right when he was about to find a place to stay, he suddenly sensed something in his heart, and he turned around to look. He saw a young man walking out from the void, and he couldn't help but be surprised. "Fellow Taoist Danny?" Danny came before him and bowed back, saying, "Fellow Taoist Huan Tong, you're too kind." Huan Tong looked at him a few times and was a little puzzled. He said, "So fellow Taoist Dan Yi is still in the All-Being. Just now, I sensed that the chi of my peers in the All-Being had all been destroyed, so I thought you were also exiled into eternal silence like everyone else." Although he said that, when he thought about it again, he frowned inwardly and looked at Dan Yi with a little more vigilance. Although he didn't officially come into contact with many fellow Taoists, spirit refinement cultivators could roughly understand each other's situation through the Weili Qi. Among his peers, the one with the highest cultivation and willpower was undoubtedly Azure Saint, and the one with the purest mind was Boy God Chong. However, even these two couldn't escape from the power of calamity in the end. So how did Dan Yi last until now? He said in a low voice, "Fellow Taoist Dan Yi, do you feel that something is wrong?" Dan Yi seemed to notice his confusion. He shook his head and said, "I was forced into a coma by the tribulation power just now, so I didn't know what was going on in the outside world. I thought that I had already entered a state of stillness, but for some reason, all of the tribulation power retreated at the same time. I'm still within everything." Huan Tong frowned slightly. After he achieved the spirit refinement realm, he knew that Dan Yi was the reincarnation of the spirit of creation. Therefore, his first thought was whether the spirit of creation had done something to him. He didn't doubt Dan Yi himself, but there were some things that couldn't be decided by him. With a serious expression, he said, "Fellow Taoist Dan Yi, I think something is wrong with your body. Why don't you go to fellow Taoist Xuanyuan's place to verify it?" Dan Yi said, "That's exactly what I was thinking, but I don't know what's wrong with my body. I'm afraid that I'll change my mind halfway to fellow Taoist Xuanyuan's place, so I came to find you first. I don't know if this is the right thing to do. If I offend you in any way, please forgive me." Huan Tong sighed. "Fellow Taoist is too serious. This is what I should do." Dan Yi's move could be said to be very cautious. If he really fell into any trap, he would be able to react in time with Huan Tong by his side. After the two finished their discussion, they went to Xianyuan Heaven together. In a flash, they arrived in front of the Tao Palace, where a Taoist boy was already waiting. He bowed and said, "Two grand elders, Master knows that you're coming, so he ordered me to welcome you here." The two immediately followed him inside. When they reached the main hall, they saw Zhang Yan sitting high on a jade platform. They both bowed and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoist Xianyuan." Zhang Yan smiled faintly and returned the greeting. There's no need to be so polite. After he obtained the tribulation power, his avatar had returned to normal. At this moment he was very clear about all the changes in the domain. However, some things seemed to be hidden from him, and he could only see clearly just now. He looked at Dan Yi and said, "Fellow Taoist, you must have come because of something strange." Chapter 23-28. Dan Yi cupped his fists and said, "That's right. I've only just entered the spirit refinement realm. Not to mention fellow Taoist Azure Saint, even fellow Taoist Xin Chang and fellow Taoist Zhan Yuan are far inferior. I should have fallen into eternal silence after being pressured by the tribulation power, but for some reason, I'm completely fine." He raised his head and revealed a solemn expression as he said, "I think that this might be the doing of the spirit of creation. Or perhaps I'm no longer me, and it's difficult for me to tell. Only fellow Taoist here can see through me. If I'm really a body created by the spirit of creation, then I hope fellow Taoist won't show mercy." Huan Tong remained silent. He had the same guess as well. Perhaps the current Dan Yi wasn't the Dan Yi he'd come into contact with in the past. Zhang Yan's incarnation smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist Dan Yi, you're worrying too much. Although there's some external force in your body, you're still you, not someone else, and your memories haven't been changed. Since you've become the master, it's impossible for this body to be taken away by others. Even the spirit of creation doesn't have that ability." There were indeed some problems with Dan Yi's body, and it was definitely the doing of the spirit of creation. Moreover, it should have been left behind before he summoned the tribulation power. Perhaps the spirit of creation just wanted to make Dan Yi a useful chess piece in its hands when the conditions were ripe, so it didn't intend to force him into eternal silence from the beginning. It was precisely because of this that the tribulation power that Dan Yi suffered was far less than the others. At the last moment, the tribulation power had practically pressed Dan Yi into eternal silence. However, there was a trace of the Wei from the spirit of creation that resisted it for him, so he didn't suffer the same fate as many of his peers. Actually, if he wasn't willing, the spirit of creation wouldn't have been able to obtain it so easily. However, his senses were practically non-existent at that time, and that was why the external force invaded his body. By the time he noticed it, it was already too late. When Dan Yi found out that his heart hadn't changed, he felt slightly relieved. He wasn't completely thinking for himself, but he was worried that he'd done something harmful without knowing anything. He bowed again and said seriously, "May I know if it's possible to remove the strange force from my body?" "It's impossible. I'm willing to enter eternal silence." Zhang Yan's incarnation smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, you don't have to worry. If it was just a strand of the power of the spirit of creation, it wouldn't necessarily be of much use." The chess piece he had placed on the chessboard of the Great Tao had already separated the spirit of creation from its fragments. Furthermore, Dan Yi's consciousness had already been separated from the spirit of creation a long time ago. In reality, this was just a remnant power that was floating outside. It wouldn't be able to do much. Bhutan, as he said. He said, E and D. E. E. Zhang t and. Spirit said. The Zhang said. He said, E Dao. And Dao and Dan, Zhang Tian E said. Dao, Thung. That's why I can't leave this loophole. With a thought, 5 rays of light flashed behind him and instantly swept across the hall. Everyone standing in the hall, including the formation spirit, was affected. Previously, he had inadvertently overlooked the Qi of fortune. This was definitely not normal. This Qi should have the ability to obscure the mysteries of heaven, so it was not necessarily on Dan Yi's body. It was possible that someone who had come into contact with it might have been tainted by it as well. Thus, he took this opportunity to examine it as well. As for him, as a Vedanta, he couldn't control this Qi, nor would he be easily influenced by it. Otherwise, the Vedanta wouldn't have been able to use this Qi for themselves. Dan Yi felt his body lighten, as if a heavy burden had been removed. His senses became much clearer. He examined himself and found that there were no more problems. He bowed sincerely and said, "Thank you, fellow Taoist Xianyuan, for helping me." Zhang Yan's incarnation said solemnly, "Because of the battle, everyone has fallen into silence. Only the 2 of you are still here. Before the battle is over, the 2 of you must not give up easily. There are still many things for you to do." When Dan Yi and Huan Tong heard this, they both bowed and solemnly agreed. Because there was nothing else to do, the 2 didn't linger and left. Zhang Yan's incarnation pondered in the hall. Just now, he didn't see any Qi of creation on Dan Yi, but he wasn't too surprised. Dan Yi being the reincarnation of the spirit of creation wasn't a secret, and he didn't have any intention of hiding it. Although the others didn't have any enmity towards him, they still had to be on guard in secret. So if there was something strange about him, it would immediately attract everyone's attention. The possibility of the spirit of creation landing on him was indeed not high. His consciousness searched around Busushin a few more times. After confirming that there was no foreign object here, he turned his consciousness back to his real body. At this moment, he wasn't in a hurry to attack the other side. Instead, he first discussed the whereabouts of the Qi of creation with the 2 ancestors. Since he wanted to expel the spirit of creation from the chessboard of Tao, there couldn't be any mistakes. If there were any mistakes, they wouldn't be able to achieve their goal. If they didn't try to find this Qi, there would always be a loophole, and then no matter how brilliant the strategy was, it would be useless. However, the 2 ancestors' understanding of this Qi wasn't much better than Zhang Yan's, but this was a problem they had to face. Ancestor Yao Han thought for a moment and said, "The Qi of creation is ever-changing. If that's the case, it's very likely to avoid us and the spirit of creation's divine intent and Qi. Ordinary methods like this won't be able to find it." Ancestor Hongbo raised his voice and said, "Since it's useless to search everywhere, there's no harm in searching everywhere. As long as this Qi is still here, I don't believe it can hide." Ancestor Yao Han smiled and said, "Let me try first." As soon as he finished speaking, he waved his sleeves and rays of starlight lit up in the void. Under this brilliance, all the traces of the mighty power of the past spirit refinement cultivators were revealed. It was as hazy and beautiful as rainbow light in clear water. As the brilliance shone down, even the mighty force of the creation spirit was clearly reflected. However, there weren't any traces of the creation aura left in this place. Ancestor Yao Han's expression didn't change. He nodded to Ancestor Hongba, and the latter slashed out with his sword. When this sword fell, it seemed to slash at all things, but it also seemed to slash at all the Wei. All the Wei responded to this impact. It wasn't just the Wei. As long as it existed in all things, anything they could see, even Bu Shutian would respond. However, there was a trace of strangeness mixed in. It spread throughout all things, like a void. There was no response, but it was completely different from the silence. Ancestor Yao Han smiled and said, "Found it." Ancestor Hongba said, "I feel that this Qi is lazy, as if it is sleeping. This must be the result of the spirit of creation's manipulation. Ancestor Yao Han thought for a moment and said, "This chi is not like this. Just now, after the spirit of creation's manipulation, it has lost its mysteries. However, it hasn't turned to the nothingness of the Grand Tao, so there must be a way to recover it." With a solemn expression, Patriarch Hongho said, "If the chi of creation is used properly, it's not inferior to a chess piece. If the spirit of creation obtains this chi again, it's very likely that he'll be able to free our Tao techniques from him. Therefore, no matter what, we must find a way to seize it, lest someone else takes it back and uses it again." Zhang Yan nodded. This was very true. Now, it seemed that the chi of creation was ownerless and could be used by anyone. If they waited until the chi recovered and the spirit of creation took it back, then they would be in a very passive position. If they obtained the chi and used it with the advantage of the Grand Tao chessboard, they could do even more things. But even so, the chi of creation was different from the Weili of spirit refinement cultivators. He couldn't directly sense it, and the Weili couldn't come into contact with it, so how could they take it back? He pondered for a moment. As long as things were still in the realm of being and still existed in the Great Tao, they would have their own rules. Although he couldn't see the chi of creation directly, as the person closest to the Grand Tao on the human Tao side, he could do what Ancestor Yao Han did just now. He could magnify the operation of the Grand Tao and look at something. Perhaps he could use that to calculate the operation of the Grand Tao. Thinking of this, he said to the two Ancestor Masters, "I need to do some calculations, but to prevent the spirit of creation from taking action, I'll leave this place to you two fellow Taoists." Yao Han and Hongho solemnly accepted the task. After Zhang Yan gave the instructions, he immediately entered the divine will and began to calculate. Since he sat on the chessboard of the Grand Tao, he'd successively obtained numerous Tao arts, and he'd gone against the spirit of creation on numerous occasions. So his understanding of the Grand Tao could be said to be extremely deep. Coupled with some of the circumstances he'd observed earlier and deduced, he gradually had a grasp of the changes in the Grand Tao Qi. He believed that the use of the Qi of creation was very likely to be the change of the main cause. Once the Qi of creation was used, there would be a process from beginning to end. During the process, the Qi of creation would be in an invisible state. Only when the process was over could the Qi of creation return to its original state and reappear in the world. If the great underworld patriarch combined the power of the Vedanta to suppress the spirit of creation was the beginning, then if the spirit of creation broke free from the Weili siege, then the matter would be over. If one were to use this as an inference, then the matter of the spirit of creation involving the mighty power of the two ancestors and using it to fix himself could be considered as the beginning, and finding a way to cut off the involvement of the mighty power could be considered as the end. If he wanted this wisp of chi of creation to appear again outside, he needed to first cut off the Weili connection between the spirit of creation and the two ancestor masters, so that this matter would be over. Thinking of this, his eyes flickered. This was undoubtedly very important. It meant that the spirit of creation could choose to end this matter at any time when necessary, and then take back the chi of creation. But on the other hand, if they grasped it well and grasped the opportunity to end it in their own hands, then it was possible to seize the chi of creation to their side. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.